coming. We are going to start. I am very glad to do the welcome to Mari. He coming to talk about something is very, very interesting, very challenging, and let's hear her. And then I'm going to ask Father Ingram to do a little welcoming to all of you that are coming, and also to start with a blessing. Father Ingram.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's a joy to welcome Dr. Mary Hasson to our community. This is such a critical topic in today's times, and I'm sure you all know about that, which is why you're here. And that's also one of the reasons we're also live streaming this, so that people who can't make it here can also benefit from this in their own time. And we just want to thank you for coming to share this wonderful information with us. It's a real challenge that a lot of our kids are dealing with, and for those of you who have grandkids, they're growing up in the midst of this. You know, there's a lot of confusion around what the church teaches, and a lot of confusion about what these kids are feeling. And so unpacking a lot of that can really help us to deal with it in a way that treats these children that are struggling, and even adults that are struggling, with the love of Christ. Because that's what this is all about. We want to understand what's going on so that we can better help these people that are struggling with these issues. And even as we struggle with these issues ourselves, we want to learn more so that we can better apply what the Lord has revealed to us, both in the biology and the psychology and the spirituality, because they're all tied together, because we are united human beings, body and soul. And so it all has an impact on our spiritual lives. And so I want to thank Dr. Hasson for being with us to help us with this, to help us to grow so that we can help others to grow. So let's call upon our Heavenly Father and ask Him to guide us and bless us in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Almighty God, you who created all things, made man in your image and likeness, we ask you to be with us and to inspire our thoughts, move our hearts, and help us to bring your grace to those who are struggling in the midst of a world mired in chaos. We ask you to bring your order into our lives and into the lives of those we touch, that peace may come about, and that your goodness may flourish in all lives. We ask this blessing that all may be to your glory, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Father.
Mary, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, let me do a little brief introduction about Mari. Mari is a very senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. She directs the Catholic Women's Forum at the Network of Catholic Professional Women and Scholars, and found the Person and Identity Project, a new initiative that equips parents and faith-based institutions to counter gender ideology and promote the truth of the human person. An attorney and policy expert, Mari served as a keynote speaker for the Holy See during the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, addressing Education 2018, Women and Work 2017, Hard Given 2019, and Gender Ideology 2019. She currently serves as a consultant to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Life, Marriage, Family, Life, and Youth. So we are going to have two presentations. First, it's going to last like 1 hour and a little bit more, and then we're going to have a break, and then we're going to be coffee, water, and some snacks outside. Then the second part, and the questions and answers is up to you.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome.
Terrific. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I always figure the Lord brings the right people here who can carry the message forward. So I appreciate you, your presence here today. And this is, as Father mentioned, this is kind of a one of those touchy topics. And yet we as a church need to be comfortable understanding what's happening in the culture, what the truth is, but also how to reach others. I was struck by Father's homily, if any of you were at the 8 o'clock Mass, and he was talking about the seeds being sown on the different kinds of ground. And this moment that we're in is an evangelistic opportunity. So we prepare ourselves to understand where the weeds are, where the difficult ground is. But we do that so we can be prepared to go out and bring the gospel message, the truth about who we are, and to help people who are suffering. So just a little outline. I'm going to talk about how, what are we talking about here, these transgender issues? How did we get here? What should we understand about the culture? What do we need to understand about the medical aspects? And then what the church teaches, and then pastoral approaches, how to actually help a person who's going through this, or to prevent issues, and then where you can find additional resources. So first, why does this matter? In a sense, you already know, but I think it's helpful to just reflect on the culture. The messages we hear it's a lot of happy talk, right? There's sort of a narrative in the culture that if we can just embrace people who are expressing a rainbow identity, LGBTQIA2+, I mean, the initials continue, that if we can just accept their inner knowledge and affirm that as the truth, that they'll kind of live happily ever after. And I'm here to tell you that's not accurate. And so in working on this issue, I've been working on it intensely for the past 5 or 6 years, and it's not a right-left issue. It's not a Republican versus Democrat, red versus blue, because I work with people who I disagree with on many, many other issues, but who have come together around this issue out of concern for people who are being sort of carried into this belief system. So I work with people who identify as LGB, but have serious concerns about the denial of sex when it comes to the transgender issue, people who are atheists, no belief, people who are Jewish, Muslim, Christian, as well as Catholics. So that's one of the first things I want you to understand, that we can't allow ourselves to look at this as a polarized issue. It really is a question of understanding the truth about the human person. And that's a truth we can speak to anyone. We can find common ground with anyone who has a concern for others. And so one of the other things that I've learned in working on this issue is that even those with whom we disagree, so for example, I regularly encounter people who are on the other side of this, who are pushing this through the culture, through law, through schools. And what we do share in common is this: a genuine concern for people who are hurting. And I think that's a common ground. So it's important to get the facts right, because if we want to help people who are hurting, we have to understand the truth of this issue, the truth about who we are, and then to help people find that truth. So it helps to presume the best of those who may disagree with you and to look for that common ground. But the really important thing I want to emphasize here at the outset is that this is an issue that there is so much pain around, so much pain. And not just pain for those families, for example, who are touched by it, and the parents are trying to retether the kids to reality, to the truth about who they are, and sometimes there's alienation and fracturing of relationships. That's pain all around for the individual who's suffering, but also for the siblings, the parents. But there's also pain for those who choose to say, okay, I'm going to affirm this, I'm going to go with this, I'm going to call my son a daughter, and all those things. There's still a lot of pain in those relationships because relationships are broken or changed. And oftentimes there's a pressure to pretend there's no loss. So I think in opening up this topic, we have to have our hearts in the right place with just genuine compassion and empathy for anyone who is experiencing this, whether as an individual or someone they love or care very much about. So I'd like to begin by thinking about how Pope Francis has approached this issue. So from the beginning of his papacy, he has reached out to persons who identify as transgender. And he's He's given them shelter, he's given them material things. He's really just opened his arms. And in particular, there was one occasion, the person whose image is up here is a woman who went by the name Diego. So she went through a transition, changed her appearance and started identifying as a man. And she's Catholic, she lives in Spain. And she wrote to the Pope and she said, I feel like I'm being persecuted in my own parish. And he said, come see me. And this was all private at the time. And he spent over an hour talking with her. And his message at the end of that was not to reveal the contents of that personal conversation, but was a message to us to say, anyone who's struggling, we need to accompany them and not abandon them. And we'll talk later in the pastoral segment about how to understand accompaniment. It doesn't mean approval. It doesn't mean you just sort of go along with whatever anyone wants. Anyone who's a parent knows that, right? People you love oftentimes want things that are not healthy or good for them. But he said we have to have hearts that are committed to loving the person and walking with them. But that's not all that Pope Francis has said about this issue. So this same Pope who has demonstrated by his own actions this genuine concern for the individual has very strong words about the ideology that's driving this cultural change, that is causing, in many respects, so many people to think that whatever personal vulnerabilities they have or pain in their life, that somehow this transgender identification is the answer. And so he uses really strong words. He says it's like a global war against marriage and the family. So those are strong words from a pope who doesn't like culture wars. So he's unequivocal that this is a destructive ideology. So the church is concerned about this for two reasons. One, because of the anthropology, because of what's true about who we are. And that's what the Pope is talking about when he's talking about the effect of this ideology on the culture. And I'm going to unpack that. But the church also cares about this because people who get caught up in it travel a road that does not ultimately lead towards happiness and human flourishing. It leads towards harm. And I'll give you some statistics later in the talk. But that's why the church cares. The church cares because of what's true and because of what's good for the individual and helping people break free from the suffering that they can become trapped in. So at the core of this issue is a question that is central to any person, that question of who am I? Every person has to answer that question in their life, and adolescence in particular is a time when people are wondering. When I was growing up, I'm from a big family, one of 10 kids, and so for me that question was, how am I alike or different from my siblings? How do I want to be compared to my parents or my friends or people I admire? I didn't have to wake up in the morning and ask, am I a boy or a girl? How should, how should I identify today? That was not part of that journey. Now our kids today are told that something that we understand as given, that's intrinsic in who we are, whether we're created male or female, is now something that is a matter of choice, that they have to figure out. And so that creates a tremendous pressure. But the important thing here is to understand it's natural to every human being to want to understand who they are. Who am I? What's my identity? And the church, for thousands of years, has thought deeply about this. The saints have written about it. We have a wealth, a treasury of wisdom that tells us who we are, that helps us understand. The first thing to understand is that we're creatures. We're created by God. That means from the first moment of our existence, every person who's here, you are in relationship with a God who loves you. And in a culture that is dying of loneliness, of isolation, drawing people back to that truth is tremendously important. We're never truly alone. There is never a moment in our lives when we're unloved, because God loves us unconditionally, even if we turn our backs on him. He truly loves us. So that's a fundamental thing about who we are. I'm a creature, I get my dignity because I'm loved by God and He created me a certain way. He gifted each one of us with an identity. Male or female, He created them. That's a gift from God. So we know who we are because of our creation. Creation, male and female. What else do we know? Our dignity comes because we're loved by God and we're created in His image and likeness. And that's one of the key things today. A lot of young people are struggling to think, why do I matter? Why should I be valued? And because they're looking for that affirmation from the likes on social media, from something external. We know that our dignity and value doesn't depend on our bank accounts, doesn't depend on where we're from, doesn't depend on what we look like or how fit we are or anything. Our dignity comes from being loved and made in God's image. And we can't lose that. We can't lose that. So that's a critical point too. What else do we know? God who created us is the designer. He created us with a human nature. It's not an accident that we're created a certain way. You know, I oftentimes will talk to high schoolers and I'll ask, okay, so how many of you have a car? And especially juniors and seniors, so like they're all proud they have a car. And I said, great, it's your car. You can do with it what you want, right? They're all like, yeah. I said, all right, what if you got up today and you decided instead of putting gas in that tank, you want to put a can of beer and run it on beer instead of gas? You could do that, right? Are you free to do that? Sure. What's going to happen? You're going to be a pedestrian. Your car is not going to work. Why? Because the designer, the person who designed that car, designed it to work a certain way. In the same way, our bodies, who we are, we have a designer too. And He designed us to work a certain way. So one of the truths of the faith is to realize that our bodies tell us something about who we are. And that's where John Paul II, with his theology of the body, did just such an extensive catechesis on that I can't do justice here in a matter of minutes. But a couple of truths. We can look at our bodies and we can realize we're made for relationship. Male and female were made one for another. It's written into the design of our bodies. We also know by looking at our bodies that male and female, when we come together, we create new life. Again, we're destined and called to relationship. So family is rooted in that concept of sexual difference. That's part of God's design. We also know that we're human beings. We're not God. So we're all broken and sinful in some way. And none of us is better than any other. Some people have one particular sin or burden, others have others. But we're all broken in some way. But the good news is we're also redeemed. We have grace. God came, Jesus came, died, and rose for us so that we will have the grace to live and overcome whatever difficulties are in front of us. We're not abandoned. So that's the basic truth of who we are as Christians. Now, as Catholics too, we're a faith of faith and reason. So we look also to science. Science is not perfect because it's human knowledge that's in the process of learning things. But there are some things that science tells us that are very important to this conversation. First of all, there are only two sexes. That's one of the basic truths that's getting very clouded out there in the culture. People are saying, no, there's no binary, it's all fluid, there's a spectrum. Not true. One of the guys who works on this issue a lot is an atheist evolutionary biologist, and he's been an extremely strong voice in terms of coming out and insisting, no, you have to understand what sex means. Sex, male or female, is the design of the whole organism for a reproductive role. There has never been anyone, putting aside Jesus and the Immaculate Conception, there has never been any human being to walk this earth who is not the product of a male and female coming together. So sex is a classification across biology that tells us something about the organism's design for a reproductive role. You either make large gametes, ova, in the case of humans, or small gametes, sperm. It can't change. The National Institutes of Health published a book in 2011 that went into this whole fact of sexual difference and how important it is for health. And one of the things that they said was a memorable phrase, that every cell has a sex. Your identity as male or female is imprinted genetically in every cell of your body. So no matter what clothes you change, no matter what body parts you alter, you cannot change the cells in your body. Okay, so sex is an immutable fact of human existence. You are created male or you are created female. And there's an interesting study that I love that was done out at Stanford. People will sometimes say, well, no, the sex differences that we see are all a matter of stereotypes and social conditioning. And so now they've got imaging of brain waves, right? And you can see that male-female brain patterns are different. The way the two sides of our brains communicate with each other are different. So at this particular study at Stanford, they looked at pregnant women and they imaged the brain patterns of the unborn children. Okay, no social influence there, no stereotypes or anything. And they could predict with 100% certainty which unborn children were male and which were female. Okay, these are built-in differences. They cannot change. Now you might say, well, what about this whole idea of intersex? The technical name for intersex is a disorder of sexual development. So I have a friend whose daughter was born with a heart defect. There was something wrong with one of the chambers, so her blood was not pumping the right way. The fact that her daughter had a developmental defect of the heart didn't mean that all of a sudden there's a new kind of person who's supposed to have this kind of heart. Nor did it mean that she was had any less dignity or value because she had this disorder of her heart. Well, in the same way, sometimes people in utero, as they're developing, something goes awry, either in their hormones, their chromosomes, the reproductive organs, and so they're born with what's called a disorder of sexual development. The number of cases in which they can't tell is a fraction of a percent. But the category of disorders of sexual development is very broad. It doesn't mean you can't figure out that someone's male or female. In fact, with DNA testing, it's extremely rare, and we're talking like 0.002% of the population where they'd have something that's really ambiguous, and you leave that up to the doctors. But it's a disorder of male development or a disorder of female development. Okay, so it doesn't mean there's all of a sudden some other kinds of sex or there's a spectrum. Not true. Just like a heart disorder, it's just a disorder of sexual development. So that's an important thing to know. What else should we know? People oftentimes will say, when they're identifying as transgender or non-binary or something, they say, but I'm not like the other girls, or I'm not like the other boys. So therefore, I must not be that way. And so this graph was created by an endocrinologist who works on this, and with a psychologist as well. And what they're showing here is the results of data across cultures, global data, that no matter whether you're talking about people in Africa, the US, South America, you will always see a tendency of female traits and male traits. It's just a fact of nature. But how should we understand that? Those are personality traits and interest differences. But just because, let's say, a female has interests that are more typical of a male, doesn't mean she's any less female. That's just the unique combination of her interests, her personality, and people should be free to express that. So one of the things that's damaging about the whole transgender issue is it's created a resurgence of stereotypes, where I've literally heard parents say, wait a minute, my son always liked to play with his sister's dolls. Maybe he's really a girl, No, he's male, he's a boy. You can have interests that are less typical, but it doesn't make you more or less female. So one of the challenges here, just as a culture, is to give people room to express their interests and their unique personalities, but realizing it does not change the fact of who we are, created male or female. So what about gender ideology? What does this transgender issue, what's the different vision of the person that it puts forth? I think even just looking at the images, you can see there's something very different about it. You know, and these images are in schools across the country. The genderbread person, the gender unicorn. The genderbread person was the first image that was created to sort of express this different vision of the person as not being either male or female, and rather being a dimension, or an assemblage or a grouping of all these different dimensions. Your gender identity, your gender expression, your sexual orientation, your romantic orientation, your sex assigned at birth, your body parts, all of those things that you could mix and match, and there's no coherence. Nothing has to connect to anything else. But when they first made that genderbread person, some people protested, some people who were very much in favor of gender ideology, and they said, no, that looks too male. So we have to have some other symbol. So the unicorn has sort of become a symbol for those who are promoting this different vision of the person. So what should we understand about this vision of the person? Instead of understanding we're created beings, that God created us, we have a given identity as a gift from God, God's out of the picture, and instead we're told we can self-define. I get to decide who I am. If I don't like my body, I can change it because I'm in charge. So there is no creator. Identity is self-defined. And it can change from moment to moment. It can be fluid, it can be variable. And you might say, well, how then do you know who someone is? Well, under this way of thinking, identity can only be known if it's declared. You can't assume. In fact, I was at a Catholic university back east a number of years ago on National Coming Out Day. And people were wearing t-shirts that said, no assumptions, no judgments. So I went up to a couple of the kids and I said, explain that to me. You know, what do you mean? And they said, no assumptions. You can't look at me and say, that's a male or that's a female, because I could be anyone. And you can't judge me. You can't decide whether my self-declared identity is a good thing, a bad thing, true or false. So that's where this ideology goes. It also means there's no human nature. And there's a specific, when you get into the theory of this, the queer theory that is behind this, and that's what it's called in academia, it's very specific. They reject the concept of there being a design or a human nature, which makes sense. If you reject the designer, you're going to reject the idea that there's any sort of a design. So what does that tell us about the body? Well, the body then is viewed differently. The body is viewed as merely a tool to carry out my desires. So you have this split between mind and body. Or your body is a canvas for personal expression. I can paint it up however I want. I can change body parts however I want in order to express my feelings. So it's a priority of feelings. And if you remember when we were talking about the Christian vision of the person, we look at the body and we understand something about sex and males and females being made for one another. Once you take away the significance of sexual difference, you take away the significance of sex. Sex becomes just about pleasure. And you can match up with whoever makes you feel good, because that's all it's about. There's no reproduction, there's no complementarity in terms of males and females being designed for one another. But when you erase sexual difference, you erase the foundation of the family. And so there's an idea that's called the chosen family, or some people call it the glitter family. All people who are identifying anywhere on the LGBT, that we're not bound by any actual relationship. Rather, we just choose who we want to adopt as a family, but bonds that are so fragile are easily undone. And that's what we see, that family really means nothing in that context. It's temporary alliances for adult gratification. And then finally, whereas we understand it, every one of us is broken in some way. No one is perfect. And that thank God we have the compassion of others and the grace of God and the community of others to love us and help us get through life. The idea under gender ideology is very different. Instead, the world is divided into oppressors and the oppressed. And you don't want to be, well, being oppressed gives you a victimhood status, but you don't actually want to be oppressed. You want to be on top of the heap. So it's a very antagonistic way of framing human relationships. It's important to understand the vocabulary of gender ideology, because whereas we talk about male, female, and when I was growing up, people used the word gender as a synonym for sex to mean male, female, or sexual difference. And there's a long history as to why that's true that I can't go into right now. But under gender ideology, gender has a completely different meaning. So one of the things as Catholics we have to do is be very clear in our language. When we're talking about males and females, when we're talking about sex and sexual difference. Don't use the word gender, and that'll become clear as I talk about it. So according to gender ideology, the most important fact about who you are is your, quote, gender identity. Now, when you hear that word, and we're hearing a lot of it, it's in laws, it's being pushed through the schools. You may go to your physician's office, and they'll have a line on the form now. They'll say, what's your gender identity? Gender identity is nothing more than your self-perception. It's interior, it's your feeling, it's subjective. You can't test it, you can't image it, you can't measure it, you can't prove it. It's a feeling, a self-perception. So the Human Rights Campaign Foundation, which is one of the big lobbyists pushing a lot of this stuff through the law, they have something they call a coming out guide. And they say, what's gender identity? It's your concept of self. It's how you think of yourself, how you feel about yourself, okay? The significance in gender ideology is that gender identity, that subjective feeling, overrides everything. So the fact that I'm a woman, if I wake up today and say my gender identity is male, and therefore I want to be on the boys' sports team or be in the male bathroom, the law should let me, because what matters is how I feel, how I define myself, that there's no objective standard. So that's why we're having some of these cultural clashes. But it's a belief system that who you are is not something objective, but something completely subjective, self-defined. So that's gender identity. Gender identity, think self-perception. Gender expression is what you do on the outside to express this inner feeling. So if I wake up and I identify as a male, well then maybe I'm going to change my hair, change my clothes, change my name, change my pronouns. That's gender expression. Sexual orientation, romantic orientation, the significance there is just we're forever dividing the person, right? Saying these things don't go together. And again, the Catholic vision of the person is that we're an integrated whole. We're made a certain way, whereas it all gets fractured. But it's important here to understand how gender ideology or gender identity ideology looks at the body. Because you can't deny we have a body, right? So it deconstructs it. It talks about your sex as not a fact, male or female, but rather as a label, your sex assigned at birth. And that's a phrase Catholics should never use. Why? Because the implicit assumption is that your sex is not objective or real, that it's not immutable. It's that it's an arbitrary designation, a label. And I was actually just looking at some materials put out by GLSEN, G-L-S-E-N. They do a lot of work in the schools. And they're talking about that concept of sex assigned at birth. And they literally say it's nothing more than a label put on you by medical personnel. So there are children's books now. They're designed to help young kids sort of embrace this ideology. And the children's books will say, who you are is this. When you were born, the doctors took a look at your body and made a guess as to who you are. But only you know for sure. Why? Because if sex assigned at birth is nothing more than an arbitrary label, If you don't like that label, you can peel it off, throw it away, and get a new one. You stick a new one on. Okay, so sex is broken down and it's made less significant, treated like nothing more than a label. And then you might say, well, wait a minute, we still have body parts. So that's the other thing that happens in gender ideology. It says, okay, you have these parts, but they're really not connected to being male, female, or your gender identity or anything. They're kind of interchangeable. They're just parts. And so there's a gender doc out in California who a number of years ago was giving a session to parents, because she refers kids for medical transition all the time. And one of the parents was concerned because this doctor refers young teen girls, as young as 13, 14, for double mastectomies. If they feel like a male, she'll say, we can help you. We can get rid of those breasts that you don't like looking at. And so one of the people in the audience said, but wait a minute, what if they regret it? What if they've made a mistake? And my daughter's not really a girl, or not really a boy, she's really a girl. Yes, she's really a girl. And this doctor said, literally, you can still find the videotape on YouTube, not videotape, video. She said, if they want breasts later, they can go get them, right? Fungible body parts. But the reality is, I oftentimes work with a couple of doctors doing these talks, and they always just are incensed that other doctors would say that. Because obviously, when a young teen girl gets her breasts cut off, she's never gonna nurse. Yes, you can implant silicone, but it's not the same. So you can't just get breasts later. And certainly the same thing with genitals and things like that. So there's a new document that came out, put out by something called WPATH, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. They're putting out what they call standards, and they've done this for a while, but they've come under a lot of criticism because it's not evidence-based, it doesn't make sense, so they're trying to remake themselves. But anyway, I was just reading this morning their latest ones that they just came out with, and they're talking about removing genitals of teenage children. And again, they know that means loss of fertility. It means loss of sexual function, because whatever messing around you do there to create the facsimile of a new set of genitals isn't going to work the same way. And yet they put it out there in these guidelines as, well, this is something to be discussed. Now, I don't know about you, but I have 7 kids who are now adults. There isn't one of them at the age of 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, even 18, who fully would have understood what it means to lose your sexual capacity, to lose your fertility. Most 13-year-olds aren't thinking, wow, I can't wait to have kids. They're thinking about, I want to go to the football game, or I want to do something else. So it's not on their horizon. And yet the medical choices they're being forced to make, or their parents are encouraging them to make, have lifelong repercussions. So I'll get more into that. But just realize this nomenclature, this terminology has built-in ideological assumptions. And that's why we shouldn't use it. We need to stick to what's true. What's true, we're created male and female. That is our sex, our sexual identity. So unfortunately, because, as I'll go into in a minute, this is being pushed through the culture, we see a generation in particular of young people who truly believe they can define themselves in opposition to biological reality. So these images came from pride parades. And so the image on the right is a young girl. And she's holding the sign, I'm a real boy. She believes it. Maybe she wants it to be true. She wants to sort of live in society as a boy. But instead of someone saying to her, why does it feel so bad to be female? What is it that looks so awful about growing up to be a woman? Is there some trauma you've endured? Is there something going on there? Instead, people celebrate that and say, yes, we're going to affirm that. You say you're a boy, you're a boy. Okay, so it's adults collaborating in validating these false beliefs. So the word transgender literally means someone whose self-perception, the way they identify, is in conflict with the reality of their body. Okay, so they feel this disconnect. And it's not that uncommon in the sense that we've seen a very small percentage of people across the years who have experienced that, but it always was understood to be a psychological disorder. It's not healthy to be at odds with the reality of your body. What's going on here is what we call a clash of anthropologies. Anthropology just means the understanding of who we are as human beings. So gender ideology is completely incompatible with the Christian understanding of the person. It's incompatible with science, but it's incompatible with the Christian understanding of the person. This is why Pope Francis had such strong words. This is why the church cares deeply about this, because we can't enter into this false belief system and try to continue to hold on to, well, this belief here and this belief. It's a completely different system. It's like riding two trains and they're going in different directions. You can't be on both at one time. Now, in saying that, I will say that most of the people I meet who are sort of caught up in this, either parents who are approving of a child's transition or a child who is expressing a transgender identity, they don't think of it in these terms. They don't understand the conflict. They're thinking, I want to love this person and be compassionate, but that's where we need to help them understand that to love someone means you don't lie to them. It means you help them live in the truth. You help them carry their burdens and find healing. But we don't usher them down a path towards self-harm. And that's unfortunately where this leads. So again, just utterly incompatible with Christianity. So how do we get here? I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this aspect, but just realize that this has been in the works for a while. One of the things that I've heard from people just all around the country, particularly 2 or 3 years ago, now people are sort of inundated with it, but people would say, what the heck happened? Where did this come from? It's like a tsunami that hit the shore with these different beliefs, and it's carrying kids off. And yes, it feels that way, but the beliefs, the ideology, have really been working through our culture for decades. And one of the things that's problematic is because of the birth control pill, we as a culture forgot that basic meaning of sex, that sex is your body's design for a reproductive role. And we forgot that sex has something to do with reproduction. So as a culture, it becomes easier to believe something if you think, well, sex is just about your pleasure feelings, and they could be directed any which way. So that's one of the historical facts, that loss of kind of cultural memory about what's true. But then we have Marxist feminists who, and truly Marxist, at the end of the sexual revolution, they loved the idea of gender being something separate from sex. And so one of the things one of the slogans of the time was, biology is not destiny. And many feminists rightly were saying, hey, we women don't want to be pigeonholed by stereotypes. If I want to be a mechanic, I can be a mechanic. All good. But they took it deeper. And so this went into academia and became just a radical theory where identity is detached from the body. And it has just now come back out with a vengeance and is part of politics, et cetera. It has captured our institutions. And that's one reason why it seems like it's everywhere, because it is. Our media, entertainment, the prevailing government officials on a national level. Medicine now is increasingly captured by this, the education system. So when I say captured, I don't mean everyone in there believes this. Far from it. The last stats I've seen, for example, on public school teachers is only about half of them support this kind of thing. The other half are still there trying to keep their heads down and keep their jobs and be good to kids, but they're under increasing pressure to profess a belief that's not true. In fact, I was with Bishop Burns yesterday at a meeting, and he pulled up an article from when Cardinal George of Chicago was alive. And Cardinal George had talked then about this ideology coming through the culture, and he said, it's an attempt akin to trying to impose Sharia law, right? It's a belief system that then is insisting that everyone has to follow those rules. You got to use my pronouns, you got to let me go where I want to go and identify me the way I want to. You have to change my body the way I demand, et cetera. It's a belief system with consequences. So it's captured our institutions, but it's permeated the culture. And it's one thing for us as adults to experience this. When we already know the truth, we already know the truth about us, or who we are. And so we perceive this in the culture and we say, that's kind of crazy, or what's going on here? But to young people, they don't have that perspective. This is their world. So the new normal is a really distorted place to be. And in particular, children's media and entertainment. There is a concerted effort, and I don't say that like it's a conspiracy theory. They will talk about it being a concerted effort to raise the number of LGBTQ characters all across media. And over the past few years, there's been a particular emphasis on transgender or non-binary characters, not just in teen or young adult-oriented entertainment, but all the way down to the preschool level. And so it's a push. You can't avoid it if you're immersed in teen culture. It's changing our language. Words are our touchstone to reality. It's how we communicate. If table doesn't mean table, it's really a cupcake. You know, and I say, you want to eat a table? You're not going to want to eat a table if you understand table to mean this. But if table actually means cupcake, well, yeah, maybe I want it. You can't have a culture that has that kind of disconnect on language. And yet that's what we're seeing, where words don't mean what they really mean. So even the whole idea of men giving birth. Can men give birth? There was a woman testifying before Congress a couple of weeks ago, and one of the congressmen asked, you know, do you believe a man can be pregnant and give birth? And she looked at him and she said, yes. Why? Because in her worldview, if a woman identifies as a man and gets pregnant and gives birth, well, that's the same as a man giving birth. Not true. It is so unscientific. But again, it corrupts the language, and we get used to it, right? We get used to these concepts. So even I have friends who've been in La Leche League, you know, which supports nursing mothers, for years. And they have told me that it has been taken over by people pushing this ideology, that they are told not to talk about breastfeeding. Why? Because if you get a young woman in there who identifies as transgender, she doesn't want to talk about breasts because it's got a female connotation. She says, no, this is my chest, not my breasts. And so they are supposed to change their language on the off chance that 0.1% of the people that they see might have that feeling. Again, we're changing reality because of someone's distorted beliefs. Really troubling. We're seeing a change in crime statistics. So people say, oh, there's an increase in women's violent crime. You need to be a little bit suspicious, because when you dig down, you find that a lot of the most violent crimes are being driven by males who identify as women, but they're being categorized as females. And so we also have the problem of males who identify as women who are violent criminals, oftentimes criminals who have committed sexual assaults, who get convicted and they say, I want to be in the women's prison. And so they identify as women. So California, New Jersey, a number of the more progressive states have made policy decisions, and the Biden administration is pushing this, that a person who identifies a certain way should be housed with people who are of whatever sex they identify with. And so in New Jersey, they had a couple of female inmates who've already gotten pregnant because of males who were housed with them, males who identified as women. You know, so there are repercussions. These are not just word games. It really matters. It changes relationships. This is an image of a mom and her son. The son decided he was a girl, the mom supported, and then the mom started thinking, well, maybe I'm transgender. Yes, I'm a male. But you have a complete destruction of those relationships. They have other kids in that family. And last I heard, she was still married, but all of a sudden, the mom and the wife is what? Is she the dad? She didn't generate, she didn't father those children. She gave birth to her children. The boy who thinks he's a girl, all of a sudden his siblings are not supposed to call him their brother. but their sister. So it affects everyone because we're made for relationship. You can't change your identity and expect everyone else to just say, oh, you be you, because it affects everyone. So I want to focus in particular on the culture, on three things in particular. I want to talk about the influence of social media, schools, and then the medical profession. And then after that, we'll take a short break and then go into medical transition and then the church's response to that. So we all know that our young people are really experiencing a time of mental health crises because of COVID, because there was so much isolation, so many kids were just on their screens all the time. The more time you spend on screens, the more likely you are to be depressed, particularly if you're a female. And we've seen that. So you have that as a background, but then then you throw social media. Definitely the more time you spend on social media, not just isolated or in any sort of media, but the more time you spend on social media, the more likely you are to be depressed. And again, part of that is because of that idea of the likes, right? The algorithms make you addicted. They draw you in, they keep you coming back, and you become sort of obsessive about checking, how are people responding to me? Are they following me? Are they liking what I said? Are they mocking me? And so your sense of confidence and stability becomes really disrupted, and that causes depression. And again, females are particularly vulnerable. But then throw on top of it the content. So we see there are a couple of genres, Japanese comics, anime, and manga that are really promoting transgender identities, and it's particularly problematic for young boys. Young boys who get into anime, especially if they're quiet, maybe on the autism spectrum or whatever, they put on a female persona in the anime world, and all of a sudden they're rocking and they're getting all this great feedback. And it can be very confusing in terms of their identity. So that's one place parents have to be careful. Another is just realizing there are a lot of what we call influencers out there on TikTok, YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram, you name it, any of the social media platforms, who make it their particular business to encourage kids to, quote, explore gender identity, and that they're going to be sort of their best friends and guides. And you get a lot of young people, teenagers and young adults, who themselves have started down that transition path, who hold themselves out as guides for younger people. So they'll narrate their personal journey. You'll see, for example, on YouTube, if you follow certain people, you can see this obvious male who starts taking hormones and then goes through surgery, and you see this whole transition, and they're always cheerleading. It's like, this is great, until it isn't. Then they just suddenly disappear. To her credit, there's one young woman who was one of these influencers and went through it and just was, after about 5 years, she realized, what have I done to myself? She went through all the surgeries, the hormones, and she, to her credit, has gone back on social media and has said, I made a mistake. I don't wish this on anyone. You need to hear me. But she's sort of one of the few. What typically happens is they disappear. And so young people who are exploring just hear this cheerleading. They hear this great stuff. And so again, these are just some images. I covered up the two in the middle are these two young girls who just got double mastectomies, who are just talking about how it's cool, how it's great. And you can find that all over, okay, all of the social media. So imagine, picture one of your kids or your grandkids. They're curious. Someone in their school is identifying as trans, and they're supposed to validate them, and they say, what's trans? And they Google it, or they look on TikTok or something. They are going to get things that are just promoting this, giving them false ideas, encouraging them to try. And that's one of the noxious things about these influencers, is they're always saying, if you're asking the question, that means you might be trans. And if you don't explore, how are you going to know? If you don't try it out, how are you going to know? And there are quizzes abounding on the internet. Am I trans? Take this quiz. I'll give you a little tip. It always says yes. you're trans. And I heard a great story from a dad whose son had gotten caught up in this. And so he did the wise thing when his son said, oh, I'm trans, I'm a girl, I know it. He said, I love you, but we need some more information. I want to understand, you know, what's contributed to, tell me what you've been looking at, what made you think this is really the answer to whatever you're struggling with? And so the son told him what websites and things he had looked at. One of the things he had looked at was this quiz. And so the dad said, oh, okay, let me see that. And the dad took the quiz. And then he said to his son, you know what? I'm not sure about that quiz. It says, I'm even more trans than you are. And his son was like, wait a minute, Dad's not trans. You know, so it was injected a moment of doubt, and his son eventually desisted. In other words, came out of this, but partly because the dad was wise enough to figure out what is influencing him. How can I help him think critically about this? How can I also figure out what's really going on underneath? But the point here is social media is toxic. It's not like, you know, I remember when I first went on Facebook, you pick your friends and things get delivered according to your interests. This is like a fire hose. You connect your phone up to it, the sewage is coming in. So we have to be protective about our kids. Schools, a couple of things some of you may have been following in the news. The Biden administration, like the Obama administration years before, has put out new regs regarding Title IX. Now, Title IX was the law that was passed to give females, that was the purpose of it, to create sex equality in education, to make sure that women could go to college, that you could get scholarships, that you could play on sports teams, that you wouldn't be locked out of the engineering program just because you're female, and all those good things. But what they've done is they've said sex doesn't mean sex, male, female. Sex means gender identity, your self-perception. So what does that mean? Under Title IX, they are saying that wherever you have sex, Title IX permits sex-based classifications. It specifically says for bathrooms, locker rooms, sports teams, things like that. It specifically allows it. But what they say is, well, sex doesn't mean sex. Sex means gender identity. So if you have a female team, you have to open it up to males who feel like females. If you have a female locker room, you have to open it up to a boy who says, I'm a girl. Yeah, yesterday maybe I was a boy, but I'm a girl. You have to let me in there. In fact, where I'm from in Virginia, there was a case that was very much in the news about a year ago where there was a young man in a high school who was wearing a skirt. Everyone looked at him as sort of gender fluid, and he went into the bathroom to have a rendezvous with this girl, and he ended up raping her. But here's the thing. The problem was because he looked so gender fluid and everyone's kind of hands off, oh, we can't question him, he could go in there and perpetrate this violence. And they transferred him to another school and he did the same thing. So part of the risk is we're telling girls that those instincts of self-protection and self-preservation, when you're in a restroom, someone comes in who looks obviously male, you ought to feel a little worried. Why? Because women are disproportionately the victims of sexual violence. That's why we have spaces like that. And yet, what these rules say is, nope, you do that, girls, you're being transphobic. You're being bigoted. Because you should be perfectly open to sharing this space with anyone who also identifies as a female. So it tells girls their feelings don't matter. Their safety doesn't matter. Their opportunities don't matter. That all someone has to do is identify into it. And people, 3 or 4 years ago, people were saying, well, no guy's gonna do that. And yet we're seeing it. There have been like 14 or 15 elite championships in various sports that have now been taken by males at the high school and college level who identify as female. You know, but more importantly, in the school level, you're seeing this just people, today I'm non-binary, I get to go where I want. And the school personnel are very intimidated. So that's one problem. Title IX, that's coming top down. Again, lots of good people in all these schools. I personally know good administrators, good principals, good teachers. They're not calling the shots because the federal government is conditioning federal money on this. And there are going to be lawsuits. But what happens is even with the threat of lawsuits, these school districts feel like they have to comply because the ACLU and other groups have said, we're gonna sue you if you don't. And they don't wanna spend their hard-earned, education dollars fighting a lawsuit. And so they just figure, how can we sort of get along? How can we fudge it? But they're really, it's not fair. It's not fair to children because it creates such confusion. So in the public schools in particular, we have this gender ideology coming through in the curriculum, but mostly in the culture. And that's what parents need to realize. You may say, well, it's not in the books that I'm seeing, or I know that teacher, she's not gonna be teaching this. It's in the culture. It's in all the safe space stickers. It's in every class. You have a transgender kid and everyone's supposed to call him or her by the pronouns they express. You're supposed to pretend you don't notice that this kid's really the opposite sex. So kids are self-censoring because they're surrounded by a culture that's saying, we're all gonna go along with this belief system. And then you have, I didn't put the slide in here, but GLSEN, the organization that works with schools, has a calendar for the school year. Every month, there's 3 or 4 different LGBT holidays or celebrations that they push this out to the public schools. Why? To make it LGBTQ inclusive. It sounds lovely, except what it's doing is completely shifting the culture to say, not just this is normal, this is healthy, this is good, this is how you become someone. And so I have a friend who's a middle school teacher, and she said, unfortunately, some of the kids who are drawn into this are kids who are sort of vulnerable and experiencing difficulties anyway. But others are just kids who feel like they don't fit in. They feel isolated. And they come to believe, well, maybe my problem, maybe the reason why I'm having trouble making friends is maybe I'm really trans or I'm really non-binary. And so they start to express this. All of a sudden, they are like the instant popularity kids. The teachers are paying attention to them. What do you need? What accommodations? They've got a group, the LGBT club, unfortunately, is like always one of the most welcoming. They'll bring everyone in, but then it becomes where they're continually promoting it. So it's a trap. The culture is a trap. All right, so I mentioned that activist teachers is a real problem, even in states like Texas. Okay, where you can have a good principal, you can have good families in there. You get a teacher who is determined, who looks at the class and says, I know in here that there are kids who are trans, so I'm gonna make it safe and encourage them all to explore. And they're gonna be pushing it every chance they can get. And there are videos out there that show that. The GSA Club, Gay Straight Alliance, most high schools and some middle schools will have those. The families I know who've had kids get caught up in this have said those are recruiting grounds. They're just recruiting grounds because they try to get kids to come in as, quote, allies. And so kids who are looking for a friend group and who have good hearts, right? I want to love everyone, I want to be kind to everyone. I'll go be an ally at the GSA Club. 6 months down the road, they're bisexual or non-binary. Another 12 months down the road, they're trans or something else. It's a river that flows only in one direction. So it's corrupting even science education. Now, I don't know to what extent this has permeated the schools here. I know it's in Austin, but I don't know to what extent it has permeated the schools here. But there's something called gender-inclusive puberty education. It's not a curriculum, it's not a book, it's an overlay. Teachers get trained in how to think like this, speak like this, and then they bring it into the classroom through digital resources or their own ad libs. And what it is going back to that image of the genderbread person, disconnecting the idea that your body and your body parts, your sexed body, has particular functions and meaning because you're male or female. It erases male and female. So we no longer talk about, in puberty, females going through, their bodies maturing and they get their menstrual cycle, and it's not that. It's you have a body, and maybe you have a body with a penis or a body with a vagina, and most people with penises are male, but not all. It could be anything. In other words, they sort of throw it up for grabs, as if there's no coherence to who we are. Again, how confusing. My heart goes out to these kids, and even good kids in your home. You may have taught them the truth, maybe they have good friends, but when they're sitting there day after day, it's hard to live a lie. It's hard to try to hide your feelings because you don't want someone to call you a bigot. It's hard to stand out. It's hard for adults. It's even more difficult for children. So we see this false anthropology, particularly in children's books. Just again, look at the words. These are actual children's books that have been out now for almost a decade, but they're producing new ones every year. But this is the language. Adults guess. Only you know who you are. Basically, your body doesn't mean anything. So when you teach a child that from the youngest age, by the time they get up to, say, 13, and their body starts to develop, and if they're a girl, most girls don't like it when their bodies develop. There's always some flaw they can find that they don't like, and they're uncomfortable with their periods. Then all of a sudden, they're thinking, wow, I don't like my body. What does that mean? Am I transgender? Am I something else? Can I be something else? So it becomes much more plausible when this is from the time you were little. I looked up even in Richardson, I guess last year you had a conflict in some of the public schools over the books that were in the library. And they ended up keeping them in there, last I saw. But let me just highlight the Lawn Boy and Genderqueer. We had those and still have them in the public schools near us. And I looked at those books, absolutely pornographic. The whole idea is to normalize gay sex, so they depict it. And they promote this as, every kid could be LGBTQ, whatever. So we have to make this available to everyone. So no kid feels like this isn't normal. But what it is it becomes an instruction booklet. It truly is just the genderqueer one. It's just pornographic. That's all I can say. I don't know what's going on with school boards that they leave that stuff in, but they do. Probably for fear of lawsuit. And then, of course, we have the problem with the athletics. Some of you may have heard of Leah Thomas. And I have spoken with a number of swimmers who were swimming in competitions with Leah. And one of the problems was Leah is a fully intact male who is allowed to go in the female locker room. And Leah is apparently still attracted to females. So you can imagine, as Leah's undressing in there and Leah's watching them undress, quite the uncomfortable, unsafe situation. But their feelings didn't matter. They were told that. If you're uncomfortable, you can go dress somewhere else. So that's the unfortunate thing. And then finally, the last thing to know about schools is that across the country, we are seeing policies where the schools are saying, encouraged by the ACLU and Lambda Legal and other left-wing law firms, they're encouraging schools to keep private the fact that a child may be struggling with these issues. You would think that the parents would be the first that they would call. It seems like Johnny's feeling uncomfortable, he's not sure, he's expressing this or that. Wouldn't you want the parents to know and to help? But the school policies now say that unless the child consents, a child of any age, unless the child consents, we're not going to call you. We instead are going to create this gender support plan, this safe place for your child. We'll let them socially transition at school. Some schools have these gender closets where they have alternative clothing. So mom drops Julie off at school wearing her cute little female clothes. She can go and swap and find, quote, boy clothes at the school, wear those all day, use her boy's name, and then switch back and go home. It's deceptive. And so there are lawsuits in about 5 states so far challenging this. But at the district court level, they're not having success. I think they will have success at the appellate level. The problem is getting from here to there before a judge finally says, you can't do that. Parents have rights to direct the upbringing of their children. There are even Supreme Court cases on that. In the time it's going to take to get those decisions, how many kids are going to be transitioned without their parents knowing it? And I've talked to many parents in that situation. They find out 3 months, 6 months, a year down the road, where it's very difficult at that point to help a kid retether to reality without going through an awful lot of pain. They lose that moment when they could do something. And then finally, pediatricians. The American Academy of Pediatrics, Kaiser Permanente, a number of the children's hospitals, they're all encouraging pediatricians now to do what they call gender screening. What does that mean? That means when a kid comes in for a strep throat, kid comes in for a broken arm, kid comes in for a physical, the physicians ask, particularly if the child's like age 10 or 11 or older, they tell the parent, you know, give me a few minutes to talk to your child. And most parents think that, okay, this is a good thing. Maybe if my child's doing something they shouldn't be doing, they'll tell the pediatrician, and the pediatrician will tell me so I can figure out how to help my child. If you voluntarily leave the room, that pediatrician does not have to tell you what that child said. And in fact, the Society for Adolescent Medicine encourages them to sort of keep that confidentiality. It's cutting parents out. You know, wouldn't you want to know if your kid's dabbling with marijuana or something, taking pills that could be laced with fentanyl? Wouldn't you want to know? They don't have to tell you if you leave the room. It's considered sensitive information. So the problem on the gender thing is they're actually probing. They're asking, oh, I see you put, you're a girl. How do you feel about that? I talk about insecurity. Imagine being, you know, a 12-year-old boy and your pediatrician says, are you really a girl? You're thinking, uh-oh, what's wrong with me? Why are they asking that? So it's destructive in and of itself. We're seeing the consequences. Okay, historically, over time, we consistently saw about 1% to 3% of the population, and it ticked up to 2% to 4% would identify as gay or lesbian, a smaller percent bisexual. Almost no one identifies transgender. It was 0.002, and there are even smaller estimates than that. Now what we see is in this youngest generation, high school students, early college students, Gen Z, 21% say they're LGBT. And there was a study last year of Pittsburgh high schoolers where they asked how they identified, and 9.2% said they identified as transgender or gender diverse, which is the same, it just means gender queer or some other label. Almost 10%. Historically, that number, again, was a fraction of a percent. So within a decade, we've got this massive increase. That's not a natural phenomenon. That has happened because it's driven by the culture. And that's what we need to understand, and we need to help our kids to understand. Don't put a label on yourself. Don't, if you feel same-sex attraction or you're struggling with your identity, don't put a label on yourself. You know why? Because you're an adolescent, and your feelings are gonna go like this. There's good data that shows, long-term data, that shows kids who struggle, for example, with same-sex attraction in high school, that a significant portion of them, by the time they're mid-20s, have solidified in an opposite-sex attraction. They just go through time periods. But if you sort of freeze frame them at 13, when they're first experiencing this and they're encouraged to come out and go to the GSA club and embrace this identity, you're depriving them of the freedom to work through complicated feelings, depriving them of the freedom to figure out who they are without an audience, measuring, celebrating, or whatever. So that's one of the real problems here, is that when you build this culture that is encouraging kids are coming, quote, coming out at younger and younger ages when they can't possibly understand what it means to choose one of these lifestyles. They're coming out younger and younger and getting frozen there because we're depriving them of the freedom to sort through complicated feelings. So with that, why don't we stop for a brief break, and then I'm gonna go through some medical things and talk about the pastoral. So thank you for your patience. What do we say, about 10, 15 minutes? just before we head into the medical, I thought, 5 or 10 minutes, are there any questions that you want to bring up? I mean, we'll do questions at the end too, but is there anything you're thinking about? How what?
How all cells have sex.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could point me or give me like a recommendation of maybe a seminal paper or
Sure.
or something, because it just didn't make any sense to me how, when I studied science, I learned, cell has all specific organelles and then they have your sex, but the concept of
No. Yeah, every cell is affected by the genetics of the DNA that's in every cell. So in fact, one of the reasons why the NIH put out a comprehensive book, but they've since issued a couple of papers and directives for clinical studies, because the differences between males and females are so marked that if they don't know when they're doing a clinical trial whether the subject of the clinical trial is male or female, it affects the results. So they put out a directive saying anyone who's doing studies, clinical trials, you have to specify the sex, not gender identity, we don't care how they feel, but the sex of the person who's the subject of the clinical trial. Otherwise, that data is not trustworthy. So for example, one of the things one of the reasons why they honed in on this was because they realized in medicine that symptoms between males and females of certain diseases are different. So like male-female heart attack symptoms are different, but also how our bodies metabolize medicine. So Ambien, anyone remember that it was a sleep aid? Well, one of the things that they found was that the dose, because they tested that on males, so the standard dose that they were giving was way too strong for females. And they only found that out when women started having trouble. So things like that were one of the reasons why the NIH has said, if you're doing a clinical trial, you have to specify the sex of your subjects, even in animal research. So even if you're doing mice, we need to know, are these male mice or female mice? And the reason why science has mostly tried to use males is because of the female reproductive cycle, right? It's a variable that changes things, our hormone levels, et cetera. So they thought, oh, it's easier, we'll just use males as clinical subjects because it's much more predictable, but then you get results that don't apply to half the population, at least reliably. Not in everything, there are some things that it doesn't seem to matter, but in other things it does. So I will send, I'll send some information. She asked about the reference for the NIH, so I can send that to you. Usually, if I'm giving a presentation to medical types or psychologists, I'll put the sites right on there, but I didn't do that this time, but I can send that and you can get it. Yeah, and some of the resources I'll cover at the end also have tons of information. So you can also be digging around there. Yeah.
So science recognizes that particular purpose. So then why do a lot of them get on board with the identity side?
Yeah, so good question. So in the NIH, for example, they have this requirement for clinical trials, you have to specify the sex. NIH also has an Office of Sexual and Gender Diversity where they're promoting all this stuff on gender identity. So a lot of it's money driven. So the pharmaceutical companies have a vested interest. Why? Because if you have someone, a female, who all of a sudden says, I'm a male, start on male hormones, if you remove my ovaries, I have no hormones coming in. My bones are gonna suffer, my body's gonna suffer in other ways, so I am now dependent on male hormones. That's quite a boon when you create a medical patient for life, someone who had a perfectly healthy body before. So there's a financial incentive for the pharmaceutical companies, and they're funding some of these studies that come out, and everything's all peachy keen, as my mother used to say. But also some of the major medical centers. You know, this is a growth business. The number of what they call gender-affirming surgeries has skyrocketed. Yeah, yeah. And now, so Boston Children's opened a surgery center for children, a gender surgery center for children. Now, they're not operating on kids under pre-puberty, but from puberty on, which means 11, 12 up, you know, they're in the pipeline. And so they are doing surgeries on minors, but they're not the only one. They were the pioneer, and now I just saw there was another hospital, but that's going to be another growth business, right? So.
With that in mind too, with that, the sciences in the medical field, then you have the question that's been coming out, what's a male, what's a female? You ask people the questions and things like that, and why aren't they stepping up that tree?
Well, there are some, and I'll talk about that. There's, you know what, there's a growing group of international clinicians who are pushing back because some of the countries in Europe where they have socialized medicine, so they track data, and so they're seeing results. They don't have a philosophical problem with transitioning kids, but they're looking at the data and they're saying, this is not working out well. So they're stopping or limiting their programs. We're not doing that here. So, but that's something I'll cover. Any other questions? Yeah.
In regards to how schools are being affected by is it more, I know it's about schools, but is it also schools affiliated to private schools affiliated to religion and private schools that are non-traditional or just public?
No. So, good question. So the public schools institutionally have embraced this, top down. Okay, the private schools, there's a private school umbrella group, and I think it's NIAS or something like that, National Association of Independent Schools. That umbrella has embraced it, even though all the schools under it have not. But we're seeing more and more, even sort of elite private schools, sometimes they're the worst. They have just embraced this because they're all about being inclusive without thinking, is this causing harm? So private schools can be a problem. Religious schools, it's a mixed bag. Okay, what I've found just working across the country is that most dioceses and diocesan schools are pretty good on this. And the ones that aren't, it's because they're kind of doing their own thing. Some of those schools that are run by orders have taken a different stance. So for example, the Jesuits. And I think Christian Brothers and then a couple of school systems or chains that are run by a couple of orders of nuns. They have just chosen to do something different. And one of the things I say privately in conversation with them is, you know, sooner or later, people are going to sue not only the doctors and the psychologists, they're going to sue anyone who facilitated this. So at the very least, you ought to up your insurance because you are going to be in the line of fire. You know, if you don't have an ethical reason to not do this, you at least ought to have a self-protective reason. So it is in some Catholic schools, which means you have to be savvy. But I think the good thing is the church is real clear on what it teaches. So parents have a voice. If you're hearing something coming from a teacher, because a lot of teachers come directly from the public schools, goodwill, but this is how they've known to deal with it. And so they do the same things they were doing in the public schools. Well, they need specific training and encouragement to appreciate the difference and to understand how the church intends to do that. Or you can have people accidentally doing the wrong thing, you know, well motivated, but just making a mistake. So you have to do due diligence in terms of checking. But by the same token, I was in an airport on the East Coast right at the end of May, beginning of June, and there were a couple of dads, flights were canceled, we were all sitting there for a long time, and you know, people sort of start like a group conversation, and they started talking about schools. And these two dads spoke up. They didn't know each other, from two different parts of the country. Neither one was Catholic. And for some reason, they started talking about this, and they said, I don't want my kids learning that. So I pulled my kid, and I put him in a Catholic school, and they told me my kid's got to go to Mass and take religion. I said, that's okay. Just don't tell him that he's the opposite sex. You know, so I thought it was interesting that people who want their kids to be grounded in reality are saying, where can I go? The church is standing for the truth. And again, it's no guarantee, but it's far better than if they're immersed in an environment that is gung-ho for the wrong direction. So, any other questions, or should we start? All righty. All right, so I want to talk about the medical and psychological aspects of this. One thing to realize is that if you look at the old research papers and studies and things from the early 60s, early 70s, you will see clinicians, psychiatrists, surgeons talking to their peers saying, if someone is suffering from a delusion, that's the language they used. In other words, they believe something that's empirically not true. This person's a male. It was mostly males back then, mostly adult males, sometimes very young children. But if you have an adult male who really believes he's female, or who really, has such trouble with his body, he wants to live as a female, this is a delusion, and there was sort of a debate in the literature, and that was the accepted premise. But then it was, are you helping someone or hurting someone? And most of them said, don't put someone down there, you're destroying their body. And what's the benefit? You're just sort of feeding a delusion. That changed under political pressure. In the midst of the sexual revolution, there was all this pressure to get homosexuality out of the DSM. The DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. So it's like the encyclopedia with symptoms and diagnoses and everything of mental health issues. So in 1980, gender identity disorder was not even, up until 1980, it wasn't even in the DSM. Why? Because there was such a tiny, tiny percentage of people who were experiencing this. They put in 1980, and it was called gender identity disorder. And so in other words, they were still recognizing this is a disorder. To believe something that's not empirically grounded is problematic. Pressure. Why? Because you had groups of, at the time they were called transsexuals, who wanted to make this a human rights thing. They said, stop pathologizing us. We have a right to do whatever we want with our bodies, kind of the same thing as the abortion issue. In fact, the slogan is very similar, my body, my choice, right? So this group in 1996 put together it was a Bill of Rights for transsexuals, but later called transgender Bill of Rights, where they said, we have the right to identify as we want, to modify our bodies as we want, and to be treated according to that self-defined identity. And so that was 1996. Nobody paid attention. They didn't have any political power. But inside psychiatry, you had growing pressure to destigmatize. Now, there's a common sense reason why you want to do that. We often talk about destigmatizing certain issues that people have, like substance abuse, let's say. You want to make it easy to encourage people to get the help they need. You don't want someone to feel like, oh my gosh, I can't show my face. So there's a good element of trying to destigmatize, but they were also trying to depathologize. In other words, say, nothing wrong here. This is perfectly normal. And that's indeed what happened when they made the changes in the latest DSM, which came out in 2013. So in the meetings in 2012, they said, not because they had new research, that this was a healthy way to be, but because of political pressure, they said, we're going to destigmatize and depathologize. We're taking the position there's a normal human variant to identify in a way incongruent with your body. In other words, perfectly normal, nothing to see here. Okay, so that was the impetus for the change in 2012, which became the 2013 DSM. And so if you notice, in 2013, they got rid of the nomenclature of gender identity disorder. And they said, we're just going to say the diagnosis is gender dysphoria. Dysphoria means distress. So if someone's distressed over this mismatch, well, then they get the diagnosis and then they get mental health treatment. Because the debate was this: if you completely depathologize it and say nothing wrong here, then how do you get a diagnosis? How do you get that diagnosis code? that's going to trigger payments by the government or by insurers. We don't just pay for, you know, if I want a different nose or different ears and want to go to the cosmetic surgeon, they're not going to pay for that, right? It's cosmetic surgery. That's usually excluded. So how is this different? Well, if you give it a diagnosis code, then you can get payments. So that was kind of the compromise. They said, we'll have the diagnosis being gender dysphoria, distress over this incongruence, this mismatch between my feelings and my body. The World Health Organization recently shifted. It's now, they made the decision in 2019, but implementing this year to get rid of even, they didn't do gender dysphoria. They went from gender identity disorder to gender incongruence, where what they're saying is, we recognize some people experience this mismatch between feelings and body, but we're taking it out of mental health disorders and we're putting it in sexual health. So it's not a disorder, but you still get a code on the international level, so you can still mandate payments for it. So that's the shift that we've seen. And where I think things are going is I read all these studies and the advocacy is they want coverage for whatever they decide. That it's, quote, medically necessary to transition. If your feelings don't match your body, then whatever you want done is going to be medically necessary. Whether it's changing your genitals, your hormones, your facial features, your tracheal shave, even facial feminization. They literally open up, you know, change the bone structure. It's just, it's unbelievable. But this is all part of just a human right to self-define, and because I define this way, to modify my body so that it expresses the person who I believe myself to be. So that's where the mental health community has just been politicized. That's all I can say. It's just, it's purely political. And they admit that, because I read the proceedings of the deliberation in 2012. Okay, no new research that said suddenly this is all a wonderful, healthy way to be. Nothing. It was a political decision. So if you look at the criteria for gender dysphoria, there's separate criteria for children and adults. So remember, that's the current DSM diagnosis. Now, people will use the phrase gender dysphoria in two ways. Sometimes people will just say, I'm experiencing gender dysphoria, and they mean that in a casual way. I don't like my body, I don't feel like I fit in with people of the same sex, and they're using that, but it's actually a clinical term, and we should restrict it to that meaning. But look at the criteria. It's very thin. If you look at the criteria for gender dysphoria diagnosis in children, what do you notice? It's all about feelings, your desire, your inclination, your preference, your dislike, and stereotypes. Toys, clothes, you know, do you fit in with this friend group or that? So some of the radical feminists that I work with on this, I mean, this just drives them crazy, because they say, as feminists, we were trying to get rid of sex stereotypes, and now what we have is the medical community saying anyone who has a preference for toys typical of the opposite sex, not gender, that we're going to say, oh, that's a symptom of this disorder, gender dysphoria, and if you have enough of those, well, that can entitle you then to start down that medical path. So you're medicalizing kids just for their personality traits, their interests, there's nothing, why are we medicalizing that? So that's been one of the reasons why you have radical feminists in on this, because they hate the idea of sex stereotypes, and they see this as we're medicalizing kids because they don't match the sex stereotypes. But for anyone, just common sense, you're saying, okay, what's wrong with preference for wearing clothes typical of the opposite sex? I raised 5 boys, 2 girls. Both my girls were what we would call tomboys, right? They love the t-shirts, the shorts, and whatever. You know, and I've had this conversation with numerous moms who will just say, thank God I wasn't trying to raise kids today, because people would be telling them you're born in the wrong body, or you must be trans, instead of, oh no, you're a girl who likes to do X or Y. So that's one of the problems. Now, in the past, until literally about 15 years ago, looking at people who identified as transgender, or had one of these gender identity disorder or gender dysphoria. It was mostly adult males or very young children. Now, the adult males, there were two types, people who disliked their body, and people who were attracted to the idea of themselves being the opposite sex. There's a technical name, and I don't want to go into all the differences, but small percentage of the population, mostly adult males or very young children. Very young children, an example of how it might come up is you have a family. In fact, there was one case study, I remember this, where it was a family that had a boy and a girl. The girl died as an infant or a toddler, I think, and about a year and a half later, the son started expressing a feminine identity, said he was a girl and all this. The parents took him to a psychologist. Well, it turned out, kid logic, he saw his parents were happy when his sister was alive. He wanted to make his parents happy. He thought they would be happy if they had a girl again. So he was trying to make his parents happy. And that's a very simplified version of these complex emotions. Kids don't understand, you know, everything that's happening around them. But a good psychologist was able to unpack, instead of saying, oh, you got a transgender kid. They said, what's going on here? Why do we suddenly have this young boy who says he's a girl? What's really at the root of that? So they were willing in the past to ask that question, why? And what they found, particularly with these young children, was that if you either just left them alone, the process of going through puberty with that rush of hormones would tend to resolve confusion about who they are, or, as in the case of that young boy, you have family therapy because something's off there, you figure out what's going on, and the majority of kids would resolve those feelings. But what we have today is something far different. We've seen a dramatic rise. This is a statistic from the UK where they just shut down their national gender clinic, actually, but they track the data, okay? And what you saw is about 2014, 2015, across the world, you saw this spike in transgender identification. And that's when you saw the massive expansion of social media, right? Facebook and Snapchat and all that occurred 2014, 2015 and onward. That's when we saw this big growth. So that's obviously one factor. And the ratio changed. Instead of it being mostly males, it became 2-to-1 females. And not young females, but adolescent females. Now, in medicine, my friends who are doctors who work on this say, in medicine, when you get a change like that, you don't just do what you've done for other demographics. You ask, why did that happen? Do we need to treat this differently? But that's not what's happening here. Instead of saying, wait a minute, how come we're getting adolescent girls all of a sudden coming out saying they're boys? Maybe this is something different or something new, and we shouldn't just medicalize this. They're not doing that, okay? They're just pushing down this funnel. So the thing to realize is dramatic rise, and we've seen that here, even though we don't have good statistics. When I look at gender clinics, they often will report that they've had an explosive rise, an astronomical rise, that, you know, and they'll have some numbers. But we don't have system-wide numbers like they do under social medicine. We have, I mentioned earlier that we have this capture of the institutions. One of the problems is that the medical organizations that people want to trust, want to rely on, for example, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, the American Academy, or American Psychological Association, all of those, they're all on board with transitioning kids. And you might say, why? And some people have said, well, then of course, who are we to say that's a problem? And what you need to realize, maybe this is a Washington perspective, is these are lobby organizations. They're not doing their own research. They exist to put forward a certain agenda, and not necessarily an agenda that represents all their people. So there's been some controversy within the American Academy of Pediatrics, for example, because the statement that they put out in 2018, supporting gender transitions, was drafted by one person who was part of a small sex and gender committee that was no more than 20 people. I think it was more like 12. And then the American Academy of Pediatrics put it out as the AAP statement supporting gender transitions. My brother's a pediatrician, said they never saw it, nobody asked their opinion. So for the past 2 years at the American Academy of Pediatrics conference, some physicians have tried to get a resolution to say, you need to reconsider that statement because there's all this evidence that goes against it, and you're still pushing this out. They wouldn't even put it on the agenda. Okay, so it's a political objective. And, you know, I hate to say it, but it's just true. So when you hear people say, but look, all these organizations support it, you need to step back and say, all right, but on what basis? What's the evidence? What's going on here? And be discerning. And the other thing I would say is most of these organizations also support abortion for minors. So this is not something something new to us, that we see medicine politicized with regard to other issues as well. They will put, you know, the American Academy of Pediatrics has no problem putting IUDs in a 13-year-old. Do we support that? The American Academy of Pediatrics does. So they have all sorts of positions that don't necessarily reflect either good medicine or the ethical judgments that we would agree with. The other thing that's important to remember is, or to know, is that the original research on which all of this was based on a single Dutch study. So the Dutch were the first to pioneer this. And I was listening to an interview with the two psychologists and one MD who were the first ones to start doing medical transitions on minors. And the reason they did it was because they were pressured by lawyers who said, if adults have this right, shouldn't children too? Shouldn't we allow children to change their bodies? Why? Because when you have adults who are expressing this confusion, I don't know if you've seen males who identify as females late in life, they don't pass, right? It's really obvious. They've got big hands, big feet, broad shoulders. Rachel Levine, who is the HHS Assistant Secretary, identifies as female, goes by a female name. You look at Rachel and you know that's a man. Okay, so that was a problem that some of these lawyers and doctors were trying to solve. It's like, well, if we transition people earlier, before they've fully had this rush of hormones, et cetera, they'll pass. It'll be easier. So the Dutch started doing this, and they had a small group of adolescents who were experiencing confusion, children, and they were all adolescents, but who had started experiencing this as children, and they started transitioning them, but at older ages than what we do here. But the interesting thing was they reported this study, and I went back and a number of other people have looked. They originally started with a cohort of 70, but they only reported the results for 55. Out of the original 70, one of them died because of going through the surgery. One of the things that can happen is when you have these manufactured false body parts is they can get infected and they can fall off, and that's what happened to one of these young people. But the other thing was all of these people, all these young people who were put through this medicalized protocol were also undergoing extensive psychotherapy. So at the end, they claimed, and they did follow-up after 2 years, and they said, they feel so much better. They have a better body image. Their quote, gender dysphoria is gone. Well, they measured the gender dysphoria. In the beginning, if you have a female who doesn't like her body, and there's a scale you measure, you know, she's got a high rate of not liking her body. Well, if you change her appearance, and then you measure her on the male scale, where she's now tried to approximate that appearance, she's going to report being very happy. So they flipped the scales. They had kids who were undergoing, you know, extensive psychotherapy. They weeded out people who had serious psychological problems. And then they measured the results only at 2 years, and then later they did an even smaller group of follow-up, because they lost a lot to follow-up, at 7 years, and reported, hey, this works. This is a good outcome. That is the medical basis for what we're seeing. with thousands of kids being transitioned across this country. And again, a friend who's an endocrinologist said, if someone had proposed changing a diabetic protocol, if they suggested doing it on research as thin and poorly done as that, they would have been laughed out, or people would have thrown them out of the academy. But that's not what happened. People said, great, let's go for it. Again, politicized motivations. So what should you know? What does gender transition mean? There are a number of different steps. The first is psychosocial, and then medical, surgical, and then legal, meaning changing your documents. And they can actually happen in any order. But let's talk about children. So a psychosocial transition is when the child expresses a belief, and under the, quote, gender-affirming protocol, the adults in the room are supposed to validate whatever that child expresses. In other words, if you have a little girl who says, I'm a boy, the adults in the room are supposed to validate that, accept it as true. So what do you do then? If you accept it as true, then you let them change their appearance. So imagine you have a 5-year-old boy who says, I'm a girl. His parents send him to kindergarten with his hair grown out. He's wearing a dress. He looks for all the world like a girl, right? Everyone's treating him like a girl. What do you think happens when you treat a boy like a girl for 5 years? He starts to think of himself more like a boy. So one of the things that we've seen is that kids who are socially transitioned rarely desist. They rarely change their minds and go back. Why? Because they're living publicly as one sex. It takes a lot to reverse course. All your friends know you as female, not male. What happened to you? So just that psychological pressure, and ironically, the Dutch warned about that, even in their own experiments. They recommended against social transition. It was people here in the US, the first docs at Boston Children's, who said, no, parents should follow the children's lead. If the children want to express this identity, they should be. So a couple of things to think about. When someone says there are, quote, trans kids, we need to think critically about that. What are they claiming? That there's some new kind of kid who's a trans kid? No, we only have males and females. Let's go back to the basics of sex. We only have males and females. So we have a male or female child who is experiencing distress, who's hurting for some reason that we don't know why, and is expressing this identity. They're not some mythical entity of trans kids. And if you look at headlines, just pay attention. That's the claim. They're always saying these are trans kids. So legislatures are trying to deny trans kids medically necessary interventions. All sorts of lies built into that. There are no trans kids. They're hurting male and female children. Okay? So we need to be skeptical about that. And then people will say, well, social transition, you're not doing anything to their body. Fully reversible. It just isn't true. Statistically, we can see it's just not true. 9 times out of 10, they will continue. In fact, there was a recent study that was just reported out where they've been tracking these young kids who've been transitioned by their families, and only about 2.5%, quote, desisted, which it takes a lot for a kid. If you have parents who are supporting the idea that you must really be the opposite sex, and you're a kid who's 7, 8, 9, these kids were all under 12, it takes a lot to go against what your parents are affirming is really true. So it's no surprise. But again, like 2.5% would walk that back. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The other thing I would say is sometimes schools, even Catholic schools, will say, you know, if a kid comes in, they say, I'm trans, why can't we just go with them? Meet them where they are. If they want to wear the girls' uniform, let them do that. We're not hurting them. The problem is you are sending them down this path that is really, really hard to get off of. We know that statistically, and you're just, the other thing that happens is you're validating a lie. If a child is saying, a female is saying, I'm male, and all the adults in the room are saying, okay, we'll go with that. and we're going to treat you that way. One of the things I've learned from detransitioners, young people who've gotten caught up in this, they've gone through medical transition, and then they've come out on the other side and said, what have I done, and things. One of the things that they've said is that there's a lot of ambivalence in a kid when they first sort of say, I'm trans, or I think I'm non-binary, or whatever. They're testing the waters. And when authority figures in their life validate right away, they affirm that false belief, that makes the child think, okay, I must be right. In other words, it sort of hardens all their ambivalent feelings, makes them think, okay, my mom who loves me wouldn't validate that if it weren't true. My teacher who cares about me wouldn't validate that if it weren't true. So you're creating a problem. The other way it creates a problem is this. There are a lot of parents who see their kids get caught up in this, especially kids in middle school, early high school, and they don't want to, quote, affirm their child's transgender identity. They want to help their child, they want to figure out what's going on and help their child reintegrate that sense of self with the reality of their body. So they may not be going along with what the child is saying, but if the child goes to school or is around relatives who say, I'm on your side, I'll call you whatever, you've created a divide. You're taking the side of the child against the parents when the parents are trying to do something which is really right and good and is better for the child, and you're tipping the scales. So that's the other thing that happens here when people affirm this social transition. It's not without damage. It sends a kid onto that transgender conveyor belt. Okay, imagine, remember I said we've got this boy who thinks he's a girl, he's dressing like a girl. What happens as puberty approaches? His anxiety kicks in. Why? Because his body is going to give him away. His voice is going to break. He's going to get peach fuzz. He gets really, really anxious because here he has been living as if he were female. Medicine and his parents, if they're going along with this, have an answer for that. They give you puberty blockers. It's usually an implant that they put in that can last a year, sometimes 2 years, that literally stops the natural course of development. Now, puberty blockers have been around to treat kids with precocious puberty. Precocious puberty is a disease state, right? When you have a 5-year-old who starts menstruating, that's not normal, that's not healthy for all the things that puberty affects. Because puberty is not just about the development of your reproductive organs. It affects your brain development, it affects your bone development, strengthening your bones, it affects your emotional and social maturity. So it's a whole body phenomenon. So there's a reason why they pause that with puberty blockers when a child has precocious puberty. And they do it only for a limited amount of time and then let the natural puberty come back in. What's happening here is you have a child with a healthy body whose body wants to do the thing that nature is saying, it's time, it's time. And medicine is coming in and saying, nope, we're going to put these puberty blockers in there and stop. And it's like putting a kid into menopause. So some of the symptoms that kids experience when they first go on puberty blockers are very similar. The hot flashes, things like this. But more importantly, what you've done is disrupt a natural process that affects it doesn't just stop their breasts from budding or their testicles from developing. It stops the executive functioning development. It stops the consolidation and mineralization of their bones to the degree that they're supposed to. It keeps them immature compared to their peers. So imagine you have a kid who sort of feels like they don't fit in, and now you've put them on puberty blockers and all their friends are going through puberty. Are you really helping them? No, they're going to feel even more like they don't fit in because you've sort of frozen them in this state of immaturity that is not natural and has physiological repercussions. The other thing that when they first started doing this, they always said, oh no, puberty blockers are fully reversible. Put the implant out, take the implant, or put the implant in, take the implant out, puberty starts back up, all good. Not true. We know it has long-term effects on the bones. the FDA just came out with a warning saying in a rare number of cases, but it's a very real thing, you can have these puberty blockers kicking off brain swelling that can cause kids to go blind. Remember what we're talking about here. A young child whose body is perfectly healthy. Okay, so you are introducing a disease state that now carries risks. The other thing is that it's, again, creates that self-fulfilling prophecy. Kids who are on puberty blockers rarely go backwards. And again, the reason is because you take that boy who's now on puberty blockers, so he still looks like he's female, but all his peers are developing, he wants to go through puberty because he still looks like a little girl. He wants to be like his peers. And that creates an internal pressure and anxiety. Got to get on the hormones, got to go through puberty. So the pressure then is to start the cross-sex hormones early. Now here's the thing, when you take a child who has not gone through puberty, okay, their reproductive organs have not developed, finished maturing, their genitals have not finished maturing, you stop that process, and then you introduce cross-sex hormones, you have a child who is sterilized for life because the cross-sex hormones prevent that child's natural reproductive organs and genitals from developing properly. So you have a child who is now infertile. And we're talking about kids who by the time this happens, say you go on puberty blockers at 10 or 11, by 12, 13, 14, they want to go on the cross-sex hormones, age 14. You have a child who is now sterile. You have a child who also is going to have impaired sexual function. That's one of the things that one of the gender clinicians who does a lot of these surgeries was having has admitted in a number of different fora that just in this conversation realizing, you know what, these kids who never go through this maturing process, they can't experience orgasm and sexual pleasure in the same way as an adult. So even for people who are formed by the sexual revolution and measure human happiness in terms of sexual pleasure, you're defeating it. You're defeating it. So these ramifications are huge. But again, think of what's happening in our schools. We encourage someone to explore. We encourage them to transition. If you transition socially, more than likely you're going to go on to the puberty blockers if you're young, or directly to the cross-sex hormones. You're just creating a path that, again, takes a healthy body and harms it because of medical intervention. So cross-sex hormones, some kids start there, especially if you have a teen who's maybe 14, 15, they've already gone through puberty, but they say, I'm the opposite sex, I want to, you know, live as a male, or I am a male, whatever it is. So you introduce those cross-sex hormones. Now the fertility issue is not quite as clear. We do know from data that when some of these kids have had their testicles removed after being, let's say, boys who are on estrogen, you can see that there are very few sperm that are active. In other words, they would have had very low fertility just from the estrogen. But we don't have the same kind of data as we do with the puberty blockers. But what we do know is that when you put someone on wrong sex hormones, and both males and females have estrogen and testosterone, but disproportionately the wrong amounts, these high levels, it causes problems, including atrophy of your genitals, of your reproductive organs, whether it's testicles, vaginal tissue, endometriosis, or the endometrial lining, causes atrophy. Why? Because your body says, you're bathing my tissues in the wrong hormone. This is not a healthy thing. So you're, again, creating a problem. The other thing that happens with young women is when you give them the cross-sex hormones, the testosterone, this high amounts, very often it creates pain in their uterus, partly probably because of the atrophy of the endometrial lining. They're not quite sure why, but you see a high number of them going for hysterectomies by the time they're 19 or 20. Why? Because it's just painful. But here they are, already down this path. So again, healthy body, you're starting this cascade of medical problems. The Endocrine Society in 2017 came out with its recommendations which were better done than the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. But they admitted that their evidence was low quality. In other words, it was based on, quote, expert consensus or studies with a high probability of bias or very small studies. They didn't have good data supporting that this was a good thing to do, to give kids cross-sex hormones. It didn't matter. They said our our evidence level is low or very low. Our recommendations are weak, but we're going for it. We're supporting this. Okay, so again, corruption of the medical profession. A couple of other things about the side effects of these cross-sex hormones. I always think of girls, I travel a lot, so I'm walking through airports. I can hear the distinctive voice. When a girl has been on testosterone, within 6 months to a year, but oftentimes by 6 months, her voice changes, it drops, and gets this particular kind of gravelly quality, and she doesn't get it back. One of the saddest things, I was having a conversation with a family whose daughter had transitioned, and the father was just grieving. This was even after 2 years, and he said his daughter had a beautiful singing voice, and he just couldn't even talk to her on the phone because every time he heard this new voice that was not hers, it broke his heart. You know, he was trying to get to the point where he could do it, but just the grief, it's like that's a permanent change. You don't get that back. Same thing with hair loss. I think a lot of these teen girls who say, oh, I'm non-binary or I'm a trans male, don't realize you start taking testosterone, if male pattern baldness runs in your family, you're likely to start losing your hair. It's hard to get that back. You know, and obesity is a problem. We see a lot of metabolic disorders, both in males and females, when they start taking the cross-sex hormones. Again, it's not a natural thing to do. And then we have the surgery. People will say, nobody does surgery on kids when kids identify as trans. Okay, it depends on what you mean. Nobody's doing surgery on pre-pubertal kids, you know, before 12. But we do know kids getting double mastectomies as young as 13. How do I know that? Because they reported the data. Okay, there have been a few studies that have come out, and this was from 2018. But there are also testimonies of detransitioners, et cetera. This is not unusual that young girls, even after identifying as transgender for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, will be pushed towards a double mastectomy. Why? Because imagine the psychological process. You've come to believe you're really not a girl, you're really a boy. And you can wear a binder. A binder is like a real strong compression bra and flatten yourself. You can grow your hair out. You can take the testosterone and you start to get peach fuzz and your voice drops. But every day when you get undressed, you see your breasts. And that reminds you of the truth of who you are. And so the gender docs will talk about how they measured in this study, in fact, for every month that a girl was on testosterone, her, quote, dysphoria over her chest increased. In other words, she got more and more unhappy with the fact that she was built like a female. How did they solve that? Send them for surgery. Okay? So again, creating a problem and then, quote, solving it. So, and I show you this with a caution, but I think it's important for 2 reasons. The picture on the left, the hand, is a picture, actually it had healed. When they create false genitals, they have to get the tissue from somewhere for girls. You know, if you're trying to create a fake penis, where do you get the tissue? So they take it from the thigh, they take it from the arm, sometimes from the belly, but mostly it's the arm. That's the scar it leaves. It's literally taking off a tube of flesh that then they turn into a tube, they lengthen the urethra, and they attach it. Doesn't look real, doesn't function as real, can't produce sperm, can't have an erection, can't ejaculate, there's nothing to ejaculate, and very often you have problems with that tissue getting infected, necrosis, it falls off, or the urinary spray goes everywhere. I mean, just people who end up with ostomy bags because of this, it's horrible. And yet this is what's offered. You too can be a male. They're not males. You can't change sex. So this is a promise that never delivers. It's a false promise. It's validating a false belief. Same thing with young males. They are doing surgery on young males, and there's a study, which I didn't put up here, but young males as young as 15, where they've removed their testicles, removed their genitals, and created an opening, which any of you who have pierced ears, you know, when you put a hole in your ear, you want that earring to stay, you gotta keep something in there, right? So when you create an artificial hole in the body of this young teen male, you have to dilate it. So they have to put tubes in it multiple times a day for a year, and then on a regular basis for the rest of their lives to keep that hole up, open. Why? Because the body says, this is a wound. This doesn't belong here. And it tries to heal itself. So again, these young people are being promised that they can function as a female, be a female. That hole never lubricates like a female vagina. You can't, it's not the same. It's just a hole. So think about that. Now look at the picture on the right. The reason I show this was a teenage girl who had a double mastectomy after identifying as trans. But I show you this picture because of what else you can see. You see the self-harm cut marks? Really, really common. There's a high rate of self-harm in kids who are identifying this way. There's a high rate of mental health problems. For a surgeon to take a young girl who's clearly experiencing such psychological distress that she's harming herself like this, and the surgeon goes and cuts her breasts off, you know, to me that is just, it's like sadistic. It's barbaric, and it's not going to help. But that's where medicine is, that this is being offered as if this is somehow the panacea and the solution. And, you know, again, I apologize, I don't show this, and certainly not in high schools or whatever, but I think it's important for people to realize, when everyone talks about gender transitions, it's not some rosy thing of like changing your hair, your color, and you're magically the other sex. You can't change sex. This is harming kids who have healthy bodies. So why would a parent ever support that? I have the greatest compassion and sympathy for parents who are experiencing this. I mean, it breaks my heart. I can think instantly of dozens of families I know who've gone through this. And parents are really torn because they hear from the medical profession, they hear from their own kids, I'm suicidal, I'm so unhappy, I know what will make me happy. It's to go through this transition. And these parents are scared to death. And so many of them, they trust their doctors and they think, or sometimes there are a lot of progressive moms I know who are like, oh, I'm all in, sure, fine, go be trans, until they realize what it entails. And then they're like, whoa, not my daughter. But it's an emotional blackmail. I've literally heard tapes of doctors saying this to parents, or doctors bragging about how they tell parents, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter? In other words, if you have a girl who wants to transition, telling them you're going to lose your kid to suicide. First of all, anyone who's worked mental health knows you don't write a script saying you're expected to commit suicide or this is the pathway, because they often do that when the kid's sitting right there. That's a really bad thing to do. We know suicidal ideation is contagious, for one. We have the high schools around us, there's always, you know, an unfortunate case of someone committing suicide, and they instantly go on alert. And they now have all these protocols where they're not putting it on social media, they're doing everything they can to minimize the effect on other kids. They don't want kids to see this as the solution to your emotional pain. But we have physicians and psychologists who are promoting gender affirmation who will use this as a tool. And they will, I heard one tape where they're sort of almost joking about it. Like, this is how they move parents along. Parents need to get with the program. And the real thing is, most of these kids who, not the ones who kind of get caught up in it very quickly, where they're in their friend group and all of a sudden 3 other kids are trans and they're trying to fit in and they're sort of trying on this identity. Not so much that, but a lot of the kids who get drawn into this are kids who have pre-existing vulnerabilities. In other words, there's pain in their life, most of the time unchosen. not something they did. You can't choose your family, you can't choose whether you're assaulted or bullied or whatever. You know, so they have these things going on. And that's before they identify as trans. So this was a study that was from Australia, where they did a study of children, adults, or children, adolescents, and adults, and they found the same percentages. About 88% of the kids who were coming into the clinic seeking transitions had these serious mental health diagnoses already. Depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism. We're seeing kids on the autism spectrum, depending on the study, anywhere from 4 to like 11 times higher rates identifying as transgender. Why? And there's a number of reasons for that. Kids who are on the spectrum oftentimes sort of fixate on things, and they'll obsess about something. So if they get it in their head that maybe they're trans, it's hard to let go of it. The other thing is a lot of those kids don't feel like they fit in. You know, I'm not like those other boys. I don't fit in, and they're looking for a reason. And so trans can become part of that. The other thing is if they, especially in COVID, just the isolation sent them to the internet, and you can quickly just be pulled down that whirlpool. But you just look at this. You know, if you had kids coming to you for anything else but this gender stuff, and you saw this stuff in the background, you'd say, we gotta figure out what's going on here. How can we help this child heal from all that has gone on? You don't say, we've got a surgical solution for your emotional or mental health problem. And yet that's what we're seeing. So, Abigail Schreier, if you haven't read this book, I encourage you to. She did she's a journalist, Wall Street Journal journalist, who was very skeptical. She thought, what's all this about this trans stuff? And then she dug deep and talked with families, talked with kids, talked with doctors. And what she found is confirmed by studies, but she's got a nice succinct presentation of it. She found what studies have shown that there is a social contagion factor. And there was a study that was released this year purporting to debunk that. It was totally a garbage study because they picked a select time period, a very small time period, and they said, it only bumped up, the ratio tipped more towards girls only a little bit. Well, you can do that with anything, right? You can pick your time frame. But we know from Europe, where we have the better data, we can see the social contagion there. So these are some of the factors that from the studies, we found kids who already have body issues, anorexia, things like that, which interestingly, if someone has anorexia, you don't recommend that they go get liposuction, right? We can see there's a problem, a mental health problem, they dislike their body. We don't change the body to conform to this distorted belief. But here, we're doing the opposite. So the autism spectrum, poor peer relationships, high rates of abuse in the background, sexual abuse, child abuse, emotional abuse, bullying both as victim but as perpetrator, which is not unsurprising. Sometimes kids who are bullied become bullies. Unresolved grief and loss. It could be something as simple as a kid who loses a parent, loses a beloved sibling or aunt, and never has a chance to work through that. And they've got this pain in there that's looking to resolve, looking for an answer. And unfortunately, schools, media, peers are giving them the wrong answer. And then excessive time online. That seems to be a precipitator in many of these situations. So if you want to do one thing to help a kid not fall into this, get them offline. Get them away from social media. Get them out doing something physical where they have to be in touch with the reality of their body. You know, I know people who literally have had kids who were drawn down the trans path, and they literally went and just spent time at an outdoors camp. You know, the kid was mucking the stalls, doing the horses, doing all this stuff, and never on their phone. And they get reattached to the truth about who they are and the fact that some things are real and virtual reality is not reality. So again, back to the suicide point, what's the true data there? The true data is that yes, these kids have a higher risk in terms of suicidal ideation, reported attempts, and in terms of actual suicide deaths. Every death is a tragedy, okay? But the numbers are small. We're not talking about thousands of kids. We're talking, this was a UK study, and they had they put it out 13 per 100,000, but in the particular years that they were studying, there were 4 cases of kids who identified as trans and ended up committing suicide. And again, everyone's a tragedy. Those poor families, that kid never should have had that happen. But that's not the same as what you hear reported. People will say 40% or 41% because there's a 2015 study, which was not a study, it was a survey, that asked people who identified as trans, whether they had ever attempted suicide. And you got this like 40 or 41%. Here's the thing, when people are doing real studies on suicidality, they ask two questions, not just, did you ever attempt it? They say, did you ever make a suicide attempt that needed medical intervention? Why? Because kids can categorize something as a suicide attempt when they're thinking about it or when there was something else going on. So those stats are a lot lower. But anyway, this was a analysis of the data. The actual suicide data was less than 1% of these kids are actually committing suicide. Again, one kid gone, terrible tragedy. But to blackmail parents, to push parents down this path as if their kid is going to be next is just such a lie. Then one of the things that has shifted the conversation internationally, but also here, has been the presence of what are called detransitioners. Young people who went down the trans path and first, oh, I'm real happy this is me, and then reality hits. And then they come out on the other side and they detransition. Typically that means they readopt their actual identity. If they're a female, they say, yes, I'm female. They go back to their female name. They start growing their hair out. And so they do the superficial things, but they stop the hormones. Some of them go for reconstructive surgery, but so far not the majority of them. The kids I know who are detransitioners, they have been through so much. And one of the things that they say is, why? Why didn't the adults ask me why I hated my body? Why it was so scary to grow up to be a woman? So with hindsight, they're saying everyone's cheerleading as I'm going down this path, and nobody stopped to figure out what was really going on with me. So this is there's a woman, Helena. She's actually, Tucker Carlson did a documentary on detransitioners. There are another couple coming out by different groups. But anyway, this young woman, Helena, is very, very articulate. But anyway, that was her summing up of what her feelings were on the bottom. It was like a massive F you to the hurt child inside of me. In other words, she hated herself. This is one way, and I've heard other kids express this. When there's so much pain inside, you can sort of kill yourself off without committing suicide by killing off that old identity. You adopt a new identity. You leave that pain and pain-racked identity behind. So Sweden has reversed course. They no longer permit transitioning of minors with puberty blockers, partly because they had a team of journalists who did 4 different documentaries where they followed these kids, they probed the data, and again, socialized medicine, there's more data to go on, and just shone the light on appalling stories. Kids who were on puberty blockers for like 4 years and had osteoporosis because their bones were just so hollowed out. But anyway, just powerful, powerful testimonies from these poor young people. That's all I can say. They should never have been treated that way. So what should we know? That in Europe, we are seeing a shift. Sweden, Finland, France came out with a caution as well. But Sweden and Finland in particular have said, put the brakes on here. We're not going to do this except, like Sweden left open in their policy, they said, except in experimental research purposes, but so far they haven't approved anything to be an experimental research application of this. In other words, they're looking at the damage and they're saying, stop. We're going to prioritize psychotherapy. In other words, we're going back to the basics. And they're not buying Christian anthropology. They're looking at the harm and saying, when kids have mental health troubles, emotional struggles, and they're confused about their identity, why are we putting them on this medical pathway? It's leading towards harm. Instead, we're going to prioritize the psychotherapy and try to help them bring healing. Same thing, the UK just shut down their major gender clinic because they called it unsafe, because kids were being pushed down there. Now they've said they're going to a regional model. It's not clear to what extent they're going to still do medical transitions there, but there's a culture of exposing what's going on, which is really helpful. US, completely different. Why? Because we have medicine that's on the profit model. And we also have these captured medical institutions. So in 2007, the first gender clinic opened in the US at Boston Children's. There are over 60 just for children in the US. This is a growth business. Boston Children's in 2019 opened the first gender clinic surgery center for minors. And now there are other children's hospitals that are duplicating that as well. In other words, they're seeing business opportunities, they want to grow their market, and they're offering new services. Smart business, except we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about kids who are getting sterilized. We're talking about kids whose mental health wounds are still there. They're not helped. It's like putting a Band-Aid over an infected area and doing nothing. You're going to get an even worse infection. So it's worth remembering when you're talking with people who say, yeah, but the docs must know. The endocrinologists must know what they're doing, right? Everyone's for it. Well, we've had too many times in our recent history where medicine has made really, really big mistakes and innocent people have suffered. You know, from the lobotomy, the guy who invented that got a Nobel Prize. And then the next year, it was shut down. The thalidomide, I remember going to school with kids who had shortened limbs because their moms took thalidomide to prevent morning sickness. And then they shut that down. The opioid tragedy, I don't need to explain that, but same thing, that was peddled on the basis of one faulty study, very thin basis, that, oh, opioids are not addictive. And the pharmaceutical companies peddle it. Doctors get incentives, right, for using certain products. So we've seen this before. So it shouldn't surprise us that that's what we're seeing now. But we have to have the courage to talk about it. So how does the church approach this? First, we have to realize, again, I go back to Father's homily, you know, that one thing we're taught is understand where the weeds are, understand what the problems are, so that we can proclaim the gospel, so that we can love people who are hurting. So that's what we've spent a lot of time on the weeds. So we're going to talk now about how you express that love to people. But just realize for our young people, especially if they're in the public schools or in an environment that is really pushing this at them, they're not just learning the terminology of transgender, cisgender, which, by the way, we're not cisgender. We are male or female. Cisgender is an invented term to normalize the word transgender. That cisgender means your feelings match your body. So now that's just considered one alternative. You could be cis or you could be trans. We don't talk that way. We're male or female. We don't have this split in dichotomy. But I guarantee you that, you know, that's in most of the public schools. But underneath, conceptually, kids are learning they can't trust their senses. They see a kid who's a male. They know he's a male. Yesterday, he was calling himself Johnny. He was next, they know he's a male. And then now, today, he's in the girls' restroom and he's calling himself Julie. They can't trust their senses. Senses are how we learn things. They're taught there's no human nature, there's no truth, there's no coherence to who we are. They're taught that their feelings determine reality. If you feel like a girl, you are a girl. And not only that, you can tell other people they have to participate in your narrative, your vision of the world, and they have to call you a girl too. You know, so these are deep things, but again, it's possible to change sex, just empirically not true. But kids believe that. When they start down this path, these young women who believe I must be a male, they think they're going to somehow be a male. And yet, I'm a lawyer, I read things like informed consent documents. And so I've read the informed consent documents at the clinics. They never promise to change someone's sex. You know why? They can't. They can't. All they promise, the words they use typically on these informed consent documents are that these hormones or surgeries are interventions that will masculinize or feminize your body's appearance. Masculine, feminine, binary, sex binary, that's all we got, you know? So it changes your appearance. They can't promise it's gonna function. They can't promise to change sex, but by the time a kid is in the clinic, signing the informed consent docs, or their parents are signing it, they're believers. They're true believers that they really can be someone they're not. So what does the church teach? If you've read Laudato Si, which was the Pope's words to us on the ecology, the encyclical, so it's really helpful sometimes talking with young people. They have an intuitive sense about ecology, right? They understand pollution is bad, that you want to respect nature and habitats. We have all sorts of protected areas. We sort of understand that. Well, the same thing, we are part of that human ecology. The God who created the world created us. So there's a natural human ecology to our bodies, to the way we're made, that we need to respect. So that's one thing that can be helpful. Sexual difference is essential. We need to validate that. It doesn't mean we're going back to stereotypes or any of that, but just acknowledging male, female are different. Let's celebrate that. Why are we trying to pretend that reality is somehow otherwise? Pope Francis and Pope Benedict have both spoken out about this. Pope Francis in particular has expressed concern numerous times over the impact on children of this stuff coming through the curriculum, coming through the culture, just that false promise that you can choose your sex. So he's spoken, that's off the cuff, that's not, you know, a magisterial document or something. He also related a conversation that he had with Pope Benedict, which echoes some earlier statements that Pope Benedict had made, that basically this is, at its deepest level, a rejection of God as creator. Because you're rejecting the creator and the world he made and the order he put into it and the sexual difference he created and gave to us as a gift. That's a gift to us. How we live it out as a male or female is going to be part of an expression of our background, our personality, and that's wonderful. That's where the diversity is. It's not in rejecting the truth about who we are. So freedom. Freedom is always towards what's good for a person. So you have to go back to the nature. Is it good for a person to reject their actual physical sex and to try to change it in ways that destroy the healthy functioning? That's not a right use of freedom, because it only leads towards harm. So again, the church cares not just because it's true, but because this leads to real harm when you deviate from the truth. The Catechism, very basic, section 2333. Everyone should acknowledge and accept his or her sexual identity. Sexual identity, not gender identity. In other words, who we are, male or female, is connected to that sexual difference. I don't have a bodysuit, I am female. This is who God made me to be. So encouraging kids to accept who they are and to accept it as a gift, not to reject it. That's an essential truth that we have to emphasize. In terms of sacraments, there was one ruling, so to speak, or an opinion by the CDF in response to a bishop in Spain who had asked whether someone who had transitioned, in other words, who was living, I think it was a female who was living as a male and wanted to be a godparent, whether that person could serve as godparent. And the CDF came back saying, no, because this person has not integrated an authentic understanding of the human person, basically. In other words, what's the role of a godparent? It's to shepherd someone in faith. And so if someone in their own lives, doesn't mean they're not worthy and they're in a state of sin, it's not that. It's that they're not in a position because they haven't sorted these things out for themselves. That a particular roles in the church require a certain level of integration or emotional maturity or spiritual pursuit of virtue just because of those positions. It's not a judgment on whether someone is in a state of grace or going to heaven or whatever. So to extrapolate from that, sometimes people say, well, if someone identifies as transgender, you know, why can't they be a lector? So it gets complicated there for this reason, that I've known people who had transitioned and who no longer believe that they are the opposite sex, but they've gone so far down the medical road that they feel like, I can't change back at this point. But there's no confusion there. And the people I know who are in that circumstance, usually they'll go to Mass and they can receive communion and all that stuff, but they don't put themselves forward in a way that's going to cause confusion for others, right? If you have Mass and you have someone who comes up who's obviously not the sex they're presenting themselves as, the priest isn't going to get up and say, well, here's the explanation. This person really knows who they are. We're not validating this. That's not, he shouldn't do that, right? That's private information. But that person doesn't have a right to sort of step into a high-profile position that's likely to cause confusion or scandal to others. So in the same way, people often ask about schools. You know, if a kid is in the process of transitioning, are you going to accept them into your Catholic school? And the way the schools that I work with, the way we talk about it is this. The school has to know who they are. If you're a Catholic institution, you know what your mission is. It's to hand on the truth and the gospel of Jesus Christ. We relate to everyone in light of the truth. What's the truth? You're male or female as God created you. That's how we relate to everyone within our school community. Now, if someone comes to us and doesn't want to be part of our community on those terms, they're self-selecting out, okay? But we're not going to lie about who someone is. We're not going to tell this 13-year-old girl, okay, we're going to treat you as a boy. It's a lie. You're not doing any service to her, but you're also creating a problem for those around who are going to be confused, who aren't going to understand, oh, do you really think that person's the opposite sex? Or you really think this is good? So it doesn't mean someone who's struggling can't be part of the school community. Of course they can, but they have to abide by the boundaries that the school puts forth for the good of the entire community as well as for that person. And so those boundaries typically are, we relate to everyone in light of the truth about who they are, which is male or female as God created them. So that means if the school has a dress code, you got to abide by the dress code for your sex. It means that we respect the privacy and modesty needs of people based on sex. So if you are male, you go in the male thing. It also means that you can't be a militant about it. So one of the things that can happen, especially with young kids, if a young kid is transitioning, oftentimes parents are pushing that. So a school needs to have an honest conversation and saying, this is who we are. We love you, we'd like to help you, but these are the terms of our community, how we relate to everyone in light of the truth about who you are, male, female, as God created you. If they're not willing to abide by that, then again, they're self-selecting out. But that's not the end of the story for the church. Because for the church, we care and we want to accompany people. So the priests I know who've been successful in working with situations like that, they'll say, look, you know, this is how our school works because this is who we are. If you're not comfortable with that, okay, fine, but let's keep talking. Let me give you some information. Let's talk about these decisions you're making for your child. You know, how can we help you? So it's not cutting people off and saying, you know, our way or the highway. It's saying what's appropriate to this circumstance in light of our pastoral care, not just for this individual, but for the entire community, and taking the long view of how you work with people. I forgot the medical ethics point. So medical ethics, like the directives to hospitals and to doctors, there's a basic truth. We don't destroy healthy functioning body parts just for the sake of just cause. Okay, you can remove, for example, a healthy breast if a woman has breast cancer genes. Why? Because you know there's a high disease risk that she's going to get breast cancer. But when we're talking about kids or young people or adults who are expressing these transgender identities, remember, there's nothing wrong with their bodies except that you start intervening. Okay? So the solution, if a woman has pain because she's been taking testosterone and now she wants a hysterectomy, the solution isn't to give her the hysterectomy, it's to say, stop taking the testosterone, right? Because you're causing your problem there. So medical ethics says you can't intentionally amputate or destroy the function of healthy body parts, nor can you intentionally sterilize someone. That our reproductive capacity is a gift from God. We don't just go get sterilized. So think about all that you've learned about the medical issues here. You know, we shouldn't be cooperating with any of this stuff because it leads people down a path where they're going to end up being sterilized or having their physical healthy body compromised. In terms of catechesis, the reason why this is important for young people is that if you don't believe we're male or female, or you believe you can change, what does that do to your belief in Jesus becoming man, the incarnation? Do you really become man? Do you just identify as a man? Do you change? You know, how does that affect things? What about virtue? What we do with our bodies matters. You know, we're a unity of body and soul. So all these teachings come into play and are affected. So if you have kids who are formed in this ideology through their schools or social media, it's a lot harder to get through to them when it comes time to catechize them for sacramental preparation. You have to kind of start at the beginning. So a point on accompaniment, and then I want to get to the 3 levels of pastoral care. So how to accompany? You have to know where you're going. Pope Francis says the point of accompaniment is to lead people closer to God. It's not to go wherever they want. As he says, I think I kept that part of it. Yeah, he says, I cut out part of it, but you know, it becomes just sort of like a distracted journey. They're just going wherever. That's not the point. Accompaniment is walking alongside with someone, but helping them orient towards the good and saying, I'm here for the long haul. But if they want to jump off a cliff, accompaniment doesn't mean you say, okay, I'll affirm that, I'll validate that, I'll give you a shove. No. It says, you really don't want to go there. You want to go there, and I'll help you. And walking with them. Or if they jump, you go down, you pick them up, and you try to help them heal. You know, that's accompaniment. You have to know where you're going. And you have to love the person enough to speak the truth and to set those boundaries that say, I love you so much, I'm not going to facilitate you going down a path that leads to self-harm, because that's not love. That's not compassion. So the 3 P's of pastoral care are being proactive, protective, and personal. Proactive, you never have to say a word about gender ideology or transgender stuff. Being proactive means that you're forming the person in a Christian anthropology. You know, our priests do that in their homilies, but in catechesis, as parents, we need to be intentional about it. Why? Because the culture is like that tsunami. It's just, if you've ever seen land after a tsunami has come, it's like wiped away, blank slate. So the gender ideology, as it comes in, it's wiping away all these basic truths that you may have thought, okay, my kid got that, sure, of course they know that. Well, maybe they did, but we need to layer it. We need to repeat it. We need to help them really just internalize this. This is the truth about who they are. So being proactive means having an intentional plan for how you're going to teach it, reinforce it, just the basics, so people know they're loved and God has a plan for them. And his plan is a wonderful plan. So you want to figure out what it is. And we're here to help. So that's proactive. Again, you don't have to say anything about transgender stuff. You need to speak the truth. The second, you have to engage the lies that are out there. So you have to be protective, because if kids don't know there's a snake under the rock and they walk over to the rock and flip it over, they're going to get bitten. If they know there's a snake there, they can take a different path. So in the same way, if we know what's out there and we know how it's going to be communicated to kids, social media, through peers, through the schools, it may be their pediatrician, we need to be direct and talk with them. In fact, a woman I know is from one of the African countries, and she's been in the US for a little bit, and she sent her kids to the public school, and they turned out really solid. And we were talking about this, and I said, you know, how did you help them? Because the school system they were in was absolutely radical. They've been pushing this stuff for you know, more than 5 years, more like 10 years. And she said, we just make it clear to our kids, they don't know what they're talking about, that the truth is this. And you have to respect your teachers, but they're wrong, and they're unequivocal. And in some ways, I think she was helped because they had the cultural difference. I think sometimes that's harder when you've grown up and you're, you know, it's your next door neighbor who's the one who's giving out the misinformation. It's like, wait a minute, Mrs. So-and-so is wrong? How can that be? You know, because we want our kids to trust their teachers, but again, this stuff is just coming down, and a lot of good teachers are in a very tough position where they can't say anything at risk of their job. They don't want to be promoting it, but then there's a silence, and silence is filled by the lie, unfortunately. So being protective, it means first, always affirm that you love your kids no matter what. And that sounds so obvious, but what it requires of parents and grandparents, you know, or anyone who's working with kids, is really having emotional maturity and being in control of your own emotions. Because I know families who've gone through these, and one thing I hear often is, I said things I wish I hadn't said. When they came out and they told me this, I said something that was really hurtful. I should never have said it. So we have to have the presence of mind and the self-control. If your kid hits you with something that is just terrible news, crazy or whatever, take it in, you know, pray, and take your time. One of the things this ideology does is it tries to put everything on fast track. You gotta affirm them now. You gotta get on the hormones now. You gotta move. And so you gotta slow it down. You take it in, tell them you love them, but say, look, you know, this is a surprise to me or whatever. I really need to think and pray about it. I need to talk to people. I need to, whatever. You need to get a little bit of time, get yourself under control. And you reaffirm you love the kid, and then you have to let them know, look, whatever it is, we're here for you. We'll walk through this together. We will find the right path. But you don't make promises that you're not going to keep. It doesn't mean you're going to say, all right, yeah, you want to be Johnny, fine. You're not going to go along with that. You're going to tell them you love them, that you're with them for the long haul, but you need information and you need to step back and let's have further conversations. That's how you get through that first initial thing. But then you have to have a strategy. One of the best books that's out there, I think I listed it in a later slide, is Desist, Detrans, Detox. It's by a woman named Maria Keffler. And she works with a lot of families, and it's the book on the right. And she's got it's a tremendously strong book, because oftentimes when parents are in this situation, or anyone, you're an aunt, an uncle, you know this kid maybe is struggling with psychological issues. So your first thought is, I got to get this kid to a therapist. One of the worst things you can do is get him to a therapist who's sympathetic with this. It's going to be fast track. So number one, you've got to choose carefully. But number two, maybe the kid does need a therapist, but in the meantime, you are not powerless. There are things you can do by setting boundaries, by the things you say, the things you cultivate in the child, and that's where I'll come back to. Okay, so nature. One of the things that empirically, anecdotally, what we're hearing from families who've been, you know, their kids have gotten caught up in this is get them off the screens, get them doing something real. Get them in touch with something oftentimes that's physically difficult. They gain respect for themselves. They realize their body is something that they can control. It's not just this thing that they want to get rid of. You know, so working in situations where you have that opportunity, or just, we're going to go for a hike. No phones, no nothing, let's go. And you have to work on strengthening the relationship apart from this issue. The temptation can be to hyper-focus on it because the child is going to want to do that. Because what often happens when kids are drawn into this is their interests narrow. They stop, everything's about LGBT or being trans and deciding who's transphobic or not. You have to help them break out of that, not by saying you need to break out of that, but by helping them reconnect with the interests they had or try something new. broaden their world so that they get out of that tunnel. So that can mean being very protective about who the influences are. And that's one thing that Maria Kepler recommends, and I've seen it work out in practice. You have to really evaluate who are the people around your child. Are they a positive influence or a negative? Are they pushing them down the trans path or not? If there's someone who's of goodwill and they just don't know and you can enlist them on your side, fine. If they are someone who is pushing them down the wrong path, you need to limit that relationship, and you need to do it sooner rather than later, because that's just how this works. And so that can be hard for parents sometimes. They want to take a wait and see, maybe it's all going to work out. If a kid has expressed this identity, they've been thinking about it for a while, and you need to find out what those influences have been and figure out what's feeding it. And whatever's feeding it, you got to change. I know people who have picked up and moved, gone to a different city, others who have pulled their kids out of school and either homeschooled them or changed schools. Radical moves that worked. And I realize that's hard, but I would tell you there is nothing like the grief that I have seen of families as they watch a child they love go get a double mastectomy, go, get genital surgery, go down this spiral of mental health troubles, become alienated from their siblings, their parents. That is a pain that is so deep and so raw. You don't want to go there. You don't want your child to go there. It is worth having the resolve to say, if something's going on, we need to be willing to take action. I have to understand what's going on, but be willing to take action. So, some of the messages, what to say, again, reaffirming God loves you, God has a plan for you. These kids oftentimes need hope. That's what they think they're getting with the transgender promise. This is the way out of their pain, of their confusion. Someone's promised them something. It's all going to be better. So you have to reaffirm to them, yes, it can get better. But you know what? You're strong. We're going to get through this together. It doesn't mean going down that path. And so asking them what they mean by things. Sometimes kids will say, oh, I'm trans. And parents will go, ah! It's like, what do you mean by that? Tell me more about that. And if you're trying to find out what your kids think, ask them what their friends think. They are oftentimes more willing to tell you what their friends think than what they think. But that can be a way to open up a conversation. So you want to find out as much as you can. You want to challenge them if they're of the age where they really can think critically, because this whole gender ideology is fraught with contradictions. You have a girl who says, I'm a boy, I've always known I'm a boy, and yet you can be gender fluid, you can change tomorrow or the next day. Is it fixed or is it constant? Is it innate or is it something that you choose? It can be all of those, all of the above, but they're inherently contradictory. So you can question, you can point out inconsistencies with the right kid. But at some point, you have to affirm the truth. You have to be willing to draw those boundaries. I love you so much. I can't facilitate you going down this road. I can't help you, take this medicine. I'm not going to take you to a gender therapist who's going to just put you on this road, because I know that's harmful to you. And sometimes with the right kid, the spiritual approach helps too. I know one mom who was talking about how her kid was saying, if you love me, God wants you to be good to me, something like that. And she's like, you know what? At the end of the day, you're asking me to do something I believe God does not want me to do. And I am accountable to God first, even before you. And I love you, but I love God. And I have to be accountable to what I know is true. So don't ask me to violate my conscience. So not every kid can have that conversation, but with the right one, they can. So anyway, it's a long haul process. It's not a quick thing. Just to sum up, what's the problem with all the transgender stuff? It's not true. It's opposed to Scripture. It's opposed to the teaching of the church. It treats the body as just a thing, not something with meaning. You end up on a social level with problems of free speech, compelling kids or employers and compelling employees to use pronouns, names, so it restricts free speech, it restricts freedom of religion. And that's what we're seeing in the schools. Parents who believe the truth about the person are being cut out of their child's lives and not allowed to even engage in that conversation. And then, what's true compassion? It's wanting the good of the other, suffering with someone, but for love, wanting to help the person find the good. So you have to know what the good is and love them enough to speak the truth and help to guide them there. Just remember, we have a confused culture, even among Catholics. So the good thing is, I saw just kind of an amazing bump from 52% to now 62%, almost 2/3 of Catholics now say, yeah, sex can't change, we're male or female. The Hispanic population a year ago, 56% said sex could change. I was surprised about that, except that the Hispanic Catholics, the demographics are young. So you have disproportionately more kids, more young people who are being shaped by the culture. But anyway, the point here is people's minds can change. We can show them the truth and show them what's good for others. This isn't a lost cause by any means. And in fact, charity demands that we speak the truth. Love people enough to speak the truth. So, and what's the truth? You're wonderfully made. Your gift, your sexuality, your being male or female is a gift from God. You want to accept that, embrace that, and be grateful. So where can you learn more? If you go, the website that I have is personandidentity.com. It's a good sort of gateway. If you go to the resources tab, we have everything from medical to pastoral resources to parent networks. Oftentimes parents who are caught up in this, they find a lot of help from other parents who are in it. The physicians group that I said I'd mention, SEGM, it's an international group of psychologists and clinicians, a lot of endocrinologists, who are not ideological at all. In fact, they come from a broad range, but who are really pushing back hard against this by critiquing the poor studies that seem to support this, by putting out better studies, things like that. So if you want reliable information, segm.org in terms of medicine. And again, they're not ideological, they just stick to the medicine, but it's a good source. So the Courage Apostolate has a chapter for, or has a branch of that for families, not just for people who are experiencing same-sex attraction, but there are a lot of families who have a loved one who has gone down the trans path who have now joined Encourage groups. So that's a specifically Catholic support for families. And then on our webpage, Person Identity, if you go to support groups, there are a lot of good parent support groups. And then the book, Detox, Detrans, Desist, is just a great practical tool. In fact, it might help parenting anyway, just because there's a lot of really good stuff in there. We also have a newsletter. You're welcome to sign up for that. So with that, why don't I open it up for questions? Do we have a little bit of time? I'm still on my, yeah, I think we have a little bit.
I have one.
Sure.
Where does all of these come from?
You mean the whole transgender thing?
Yeah, because it's a lot of war, it's like in the same moment, like a lot of issues like that is forming in, what is the goal or the target?
Yeah, good question.
It kind of sounds like an auto-destructive or destructive, right?
Like a what?
Auto-destructive? Auto-destructive.
Oh, yes, yeah. So this is a global phenomenon. So when I first started researching this, I was tasked with looking at this on a global level, and it is truly global. But its roots are in philosophies that we know are corrupt, nihilism. There's no meaning to life, it's all about pleasure and personal will. Marxism, and some of the radical philosophies, there are roots to the old Gnostic heresy, the dualism that separates mind and body. But I see a lot in the radical feminism, Marxist feminism, not feminism that wants equal opportunities, but the radical Marxist feminism, just Marxism in general, that it's about destroying the family. And queer theory, if you read the academic stuff, they are 100% open about that as the objective. They want to get rid of the social norms that are called heteronormative. In other words, they expects that honors the truth about who we are, that males and females are made one for another. That's heteronormativity. They want to get rid of it. They want to get rid of cisnormativity, the idea that it's natural and healthy for a person's identity to match their body, to integrate that sense of self. That's cisnormativity. They want to get rid of that. They want to get rid of the family. Why? Because the family is the key structure that forms children. So if you're trying to persuade people to an ideology, and this goes back to Marx, you know, in the Communist Manifesto, one of the things that he said was a free public education for every child controlled by the state. Why? Because you have to separate kids from their families, because their parents most of the time will be inculcating religion, which is opposed to an atheistic, materialistic philosophy, and power. You control the next generation when you control the education of children. You know, so cohort or culture change doesn't happen because I change your mind or your mind. It happens by who is changing the minds of our children, who is forming their minds. So a lot of this has really been coming up for 10, 15, 20 years and being pushed. So that's how we got the capture of institutions. So there was a guy, Antonio Gramsci, who wrote about cultural Marxism, capturing institutions, that if you want to change a culture and a society, you capture the institutions. That's where we are.
I was just wondering, how did you lead to this study, your career-wise?
So,
what led you to this?
Yeah, so I'm a lawyer by training, and I've done a lot of work for the church over the years, particularly on policy issues related to marriage, family, sexuality, comprehensive sex ed, divorce policy, you know, everything that either helps the family flourish or not. And I started noticing that the same people who were pushing the contraception and abortion, and especially to third world or underdeveloped countries in a coercive way, were the same people who, on a global level, who were starting to push this gender ideology. So that's what piqued my curiosity, that there was a connection there that I started to see. And then I started diving into it. And when I dove into it, I realized, oh my gosh, as a church, we're not prepared. We're not prepared because we're not expecting this. We're not ready. We sort of take our Christian anthropology for granted without realizing that tsunami has hit the shore and it's a blank slate. The culture has changed. And it's not like when I was growing up, you know, even though the sexual revolution was finishing and people were starting to disconnect from religion a bit, the culture was still, there was still a fair amount of agreement about what's right, what's wrong, you know, what's healthy for a person. That's not true today. So that's why the proactive point. We have to be intentional and deliberate. We can't assume that our kids are absorbing the truth in the way that we sort of did organically. So the work that I do with the Personal Identity Project is I work with a lot of dioceses where I'll train the priests, I'll train school teachers, principals, youth ministers, things like that. And not just me, we have a small team. So we have a medical doctor, we have a couple of people who've done a lot of work in formation for seminaries and catechists, things like that. But just really trying to equip the church to turn around and equip families to speak the truth. Because here's a note of hope, and I really do want to end on a positive note. The truth is the truth. Society is trying to break it down, and but it can't change the truth. The truth, God is truth. And so we're on the winning side in a sense, but we just don't want these casualties if we can prevent them. And that's what's happening. If we say nothing, that silence is filled by the culture, which is why parents have to talk to kids, you have to talk to your grandkids, teachers, you have to lay this out. And, you know, so the hopeful note is it's an opportunity for evangelism. It's an opportunity to reinforce truths that our culture has kind of forgotten. And one-on-one you can accomplish a lot. I have seen miracles. And let me just tell you that, you know, on a hopeful note. I've seen people go down into the depths on this and emerge, yes, wounded, but we're all wounded in some way, but really miraculous recoveries. So God can do miracles. It's just we don't want to be passive and let more and more people, you know, fall into this if we can prevent it. So, okay. Yep, yeah. I do some to students, but I'm not the entertainer type, so there are a couple of other people who are better at working with students. I do a lot of formation work. And then I do a lot of consulting on the side, so a lot of dioceses will say, we got this problem, we got this problem. Okay. I work out of Washington, D.C. I live in Virginia. Spend a lot of time on planes. So, yeah.
So what I'm hearing is the antidote to this counteract the culture is to reinforce the Christian anthropology.
It's all about anthropology. And it's interesting because Pope Benedict, even before this all sort of broke into the open, that was a theme he was hammering because he was seeing it in Germany, you know, some of the same philosophical tendencies. And he said, it comes back to whether we recognize and believe the truth about the person. Because there's I think it's St. Irenaeus, you know, the glory of God is man fully alive. And so the devil attacks the human person. You know, and so a culture that's rejecting God is going to destroy the human person, which means families are going to suffer, which means society is going to suffer. You know, so it's all connected, but anthropology is key. It really is the core truth. That's the good news. So now we have a reason to talk about it. Oh. Yeah. Yeah.
So with the, I forget the acronym, it was the Psychological Society for Data-Driven.
Oh, SEGM.
Yes.
The good guys, yeah.
Yes. So, you know, I remember, I'm an engineer, I'm not a psychologist, but I remember the release of the DSM-4 and the DSM-5, and in both cases I was like, what are they even thinking? Because the DSM-4, they threw out any basis for any kind of normative definition of sexuality, and now it's happening, and then DSM-5 happening gender. So what's the disconnect, or where's the critical path for a group like SEG to gain traction within the medical community at large?
So they have had surprising success because they are absolutely rigorous and they have some great people who are associated with it. So for example, there was a study that came out in 2019, 2020 that purported to show that long-term people who underwent gender transitions, the surgical aspect, had better mental health and less suicidality. That's what the claim was based on this data. A whole bunch of their researchers from around the world said, let's look at that data. And they pointed out so many huge flaws that the journal was forced to issue a correction, made those researchers, you know, redo their data and published it with that correction. That's a major thing. Now, unfortunately, the mainstream media reported that biased headline. Oh, long term, you have better mental health and less suicidality. The fact is the opposite. You know, in the long term, and this is, I didn't actually go into it in detail, but we know from the European studies, where again, they track long term, so particularly Sweden, you can see that initially when someone goes through this, there's oftentimes what they call gender euphoria. They feel good, right? They're finally getting what they want, everyone's validating them, they're feeling good, the physical things haven't hit too many complications, it doesn't last. And we know that from the long-term data. By year 10, sometimes as early as year 5 or 7, the mental health plummets, the suicidality in the long term is 19 times higher than the general population for people who have transitioned. And there was another study that was done tracking suicidality and people in the process of transition. So the theory should be, if transition were the fix for, you know, the suicidality and all the mental trauma, that if you go through transition, you're not going to be suicidal on the end. What they found was people who were transitioning were committing suicide at all different stages, and the average time to suicide was 6 times after they started a gender transition. Okay, so that doesn't match the narrative. The narrative should be, you're feeling great, and they are for a year, or some of them, you know, for the first couple of years, and it doesn't last. And that's one of those things that SEGM has been good about getting that out. They're working to, they're trying to work within some of the medical societies, but they're also working directly with some journals, with medical organizations. So the state of Florida did their own evidence review. They came out and they looked at the data. I know they pulled some stuff from SEGM, but some other scientists, and they came out and said, our Medicaid system is not paying for this because this is harmful. And that was a courageous thing because right now HHS is pushing the opposite. It's saying, we're gonna pay for anything you want, minors too. So, but they did the data. They did the hard work of doing the evidence reviews, real critical review of it, and saying, this is what it actually shows. Just like they found in Europe, the risk outweighs the benefit. And this is not contributing to better mental health, et cetera. So I think there's hope on that score. But I think the big point of hope is people talking to people. Because what I find is there are a lot of people who think this can't be right, or what's going on here? But we're afraid to say anything. And yet when you do speak, you don't have to stand on a street corner and you know, or go on social media and all of a sudden you're canceled. But talk to people you know. Did you know this causes kids to really suffer, to be sterile? It doesn't relieve their mental health problems? You can't change sex anyway, so what are we doing? You know, have those conversations. I think that's how we change. And then long term, I think the lawyers are going to get involved, and I think there are going to be, just as with these other medical scandals, I think there will be lawsuits. But I think right now you have to change statute of limitations, because typically for a medical injury, you have to sue within 2 or 3 years. But most of these young people who've gone through this, you know, real fragile emotionally, it usually takes them 4 or 5 years before they detransition, and then they're still putting themselves together before they stop and think, oh my gosh, who did this? You know, who was this doctor who told 16-year-old me, yeah, go for the double mastectomy? So it's going to take a while for those lawsuits, but once they start happening, it changes the risk calculation for all these hospitals, for all these doctors. And they will no longer have the free ride because somebody's going to sue them, because this is just causing, you know, such terrible damage. So, right. Anyway, thank you very much. I know it's been a long morning, but it's been great to be here. So thank you.
Before we go, let me offer the replica for main crucifix.
Oh, thank you.
Remember